Hey guys, tonight we're time travelling to the edge of frostbite, where winter didn't just mean shivering in your hoodie, it meant entire civilizations nearly folding like cheap lawn chairs under a relentless sky of snow and silence. We're going way back, even before electric blankets, to a time when a cold snap wasn't just inconvenient, it was legendary. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Seriously, it helps. And I only want the cool people sticking around. Now, tell me in the comments, what city are you in and what time are you watching this? I'm curious just how many of you are laying in bed at 2:43 AM with one sock mysteriously missing. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We start with whispers, icy whispers, from the sagas of the Norse, murmuring about a time before time, when the gods hadn't yet settled into Valhalla and the world teetered on the brink of an endless winter. The ancient Norse believed in something they called Fimbulwinter, a great 3-year-long winter that would sweep across the land before Ragnarok, the end of everything. Snow falling endlessly, the sun absent for months, wolves howling louder than reason. Fun, right? Now obviously we don't have satellite data or weather apps from 500 AD, so scholars debate whether Fimbulwinter was just a colourful myth, or if it echoed a real, catastrophic climatic event. Some believe it might have been inspired by one or more volcanic eruptions that dimmed the sky and dropped global temperatures. It's entirely possible that ancient people, watching crops fail and herds freeze, crafted a supernatural explanation because, well, a volcano went off in Indonesia wasn't really in their vocabulary. You imagine yourself there, in a small wooden hall buried in snowdrifts taller than the door. You can smell smoke curling from a dying fire pit and hear the quiet clink of a mother's hands shaping a bone comb in the half-dark. There's salted fish, but not much of it. Outside, the world is locked in ice. A child presses their nose to a frost-covered slit of a window, hoping to see light, movement, anything. But it's just snow, and the howl of wolves. Always wolves. What's wild is that something eerily similar may have actually happened in the 6th century. Around 536 AD, historians and climatologists say Earth entered one of its coldest periods in recorded history. A mysterious veil of dust, likely from a massive volcanic eruption somewhere in the tropics, darkened the skies. For 18 months the sun was dim and blue, crops failed across Europe, and summer temperatures dropped by as much as 3 degrees Celsius. That doesn't sound like much until you realise even a 1-degree drop can starve entire regions. Roman historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon. A Byzantine chronicler claimed it felt like a year without sunshine. You're picturing street markets with no fresh produce, only dried goods, rats getting bold, beggars multiplying, and emperors suddenly very interested in praying to literally every god they can think of, including new ones. Now here's the quirky bit. Some scholars think this chilling event may have been partly responsible for the rise of apocalyptic beliefs in Europe and beyond. People naturally freaked out when birds migrated in weird directions, crops failed, and skies turned a moody shade of nope. There's even a theory that these years of darkness helped kickstart the plague of Justinian, a real crowd thinner that killed millions. Depressing, yes, but historically juicy, so Fimbulwinter might not be just myth after all. It might be a memory, passed down and warped through oral tradition, echoing a time when nature sucker-punched humanity so hard it remembered for generations. We often imagine myths as fluff, but sometimes they're distorted reports of real events, coded in poetry and fear, and wolves, always wolves. Now, of course, not everyone agrees. Some historians argue that 536 wasn't as globally devastating as it's made out to be. That it hit hard in certain regions, sure, but others carried on relatively fine. There's ongoing debate about whether these ancient volcanic winters were truly civilization-breaking, or just seriously uncomfortable. That's the thing about history. It's half fact, half very confident guesses made by people squinting at tree rings and ancient texts that could mean 50 different things. Still, if you were alive then, it would have felt like the end. You wake up to frost on the inside of your hut's walls again. Your mother's hands are cracked and bleeding from the cold. The goats are thin. The village priest keeps muttering about dark omens, and no one's seen a swallow since the last feast day. People are starting to whisper. One old man says the gods are angry. Another says this is the beginning of the end. And maybe, just maybe, they're both right. You roll over in your bed now, thankful for your weighted blanket and central heating, and feel a chill of second-hand dread for those poor souls staring up at a sunless sky, wondering if spring would ever come again. Spoiler, eventually it did. But not before the cold nearly cracked the world apart. Let's fast forward just a little, well, about 1300 years or so, to one of the most infamous cold spells in recent human history. The year was 1816, and spoiler alert, summer never showed up. You wake up one morning in June expecting sunshine, maybe some birdsong, maybe a little dewy grass, but instead there's frost on the ground, your breath fogs in the air, and you have to put on gloves just to milk the cow. It's June. In New England, they called it the year without a summer, and it was as eerie as it sounds. Across North America and Europe, snow fell in July, rivers froze in August, and crops withered under ice-crusted soil that should have been blooming. Your family's wheat doesn't grow. The potatoes rot before they sprout. You're swapping stories at the local tavern by candlelight, wondering if God's gone on vacation, or if this is the start of something biblical. But the root of this chill wasn't divine punishment. It was a volcano. Half a world away, in Indonesia, Mount Tambora exploded in April 1815 in one of the most violent eruptions in recorded history. It blasted 36 cubic miles of rock and ash into the atmosphere. That's the kind of eruption that doesn't just ruin a few nearby villages, it changes the weather for everyone. The sulfur dioxide from Tambora's eruption spread across the globe, reflecting sunlight back into space. Temperatures dropped by up to 3 degrees Celsius worldwide. Again, that doesn't sound like much until you realise that in farming terms, 3 degrees is the difference between a harvest and a famine. You're living in Vermont, it's June, and a snowstorm rolls in. Not a flurry, an actual snowstorm. You throw an extra quilt over the bed and light the fireplace, but the wood is damp and won't catch. The family dog keeps trying to dig into the earth for warmth, but even the ground is icy. You haven't eaten a proper meal in 2 days. Your neighbour traded their last blanket for a single loaf of bread. There are rumours of food riots in Montreal, and someone claims they saw a man chasing a squirrel with a carving knife. You laugh, but not very hard. The cold wasn't just inconvenient, it was existential. Food prices skyrocketed. In Ireland, where potato crops were already vulnerable, widespread hunger became full-on famine. In Switzerland, people were eating moss off rocks. Livestock starved. Men sold their farms for pennies just to buy flour. It wasn't just cold, it was panic that blanketed the land. And here's the quirky twist. Out of all this misery came Frankenstein. Yep, that Frankenstein. In the summer of 1816, a group of British writers, including a young Mary Shelley, were vacationing at Lake Geneva. But it was so wet, cold and apocalyptic outside that they stayed indoors, reading ghost stories to each other by candlelight. That's when Lord Byron proposed a spooky challenge. Each person had to write a horror story. Mary Shelley ended up writing about a mad scientist who builds a man out of corpses. Probably not what Byron had in mind for a beach read, but here we are. And while one writer gave birth to modern science fiction, others gave birth to, well, nothing. Because they were freezing. Records show that some European villages experienced 0 summer crops at all that year. Governments scrambled to import grain from elsewhere, but the shortages were everywhere. In the US, many New Englanders fled south to find warmth and fertile land, triggering one of the earliest large-scale migrations inside the country. Now, some scientists argue that Tambora was just the spark, not the whole fire. The early 19th century was already experiencing a general cooling trend known as the Dalton Minimum, a period of low solar activity that made the planet naturally chillier. So maybe Tambora just piled on, turning a cool period into a total freeze fest. The debate continues. Was it mostly the volcano? Was it solar cycles? Was it the universe just being generally rude? Either way, the impact was global. In China, rice crops failed and famine spread. In India, the cold led to a failed monsoon season and helped spark a massive cholera outbreak. This wasn't a regional hiccup. It was a worldwide climate gut punch. It's like Earth itself hit pause and forgot to press play again for 12 straight months. And still, you survive it. Somehow. You bundle up in layers made of scratchy wool and sheer desperation. You eat bark broth, drink boiled weeds, and share body heat with every family member and animal who'll tolerate you. A few people blame witches, a few blame Napoleon, because when in doubt, blame Napoleon. But most people just go quiet, hunker down, pray for spring that never comes. At night you stare at the sky and wonder why the stars look so strange, dimmed by particles that float high above, invisible to the naked eye but enough to change everything. You think about your children. You wonder if next year will be better. It will leave a scar. Even today, tree rings and glacier ice cores still bear the signature of 1816. A thin, dirty layer, a frost ring, a silence in the Earth's rhythm. Nature doesn't forget, even if we do. And as you drift off tonight, warm under your synthetic comforter, thermostat humming quietly, you can't help but feel a little haunted by that lost summer. A time when the Earth said nope to sunlight, and millions shivered in the dark, wondering if summer was just a myth told by old people who remembered a time when trees actually had leaves. You'd think Earth would give us a break after that whole no summer situation, right? But nope. As it turns out, that freak year of 1816 was just one particularly nasty cold snap in a much longer icy mood swing we now call the Little Ice Age. This wasn't a quick chill. It was a multi-century stretch of unpredictable, bitter weather that draped itself over the northern hemisphere like a soggy, freezing blanket you can't quite shake off. We're talking roughly from the 1300s to the mid-1800s. 500 years of longer winters, shorter growing seasons, and generations born into the kind of cold that didn't just ruin a picnic, it threatened entire economies, rewrote borders, and pushed societies to the edge. This is the era of endless firewood chopping, of rivers freezing solid, and of terrified kings commissioning more fireplaces than actual policies. You find yourself in France in the year 1315. The summer comes late, the rain won't stop, and when you finally try to harvest your grain, it's too soaked to store, spoiled, rotten. You try anyway, it moulds. By winter there's nothing left. People are eating their seed grain, which means next year's harvest is already doomed, and they know it. In fact, the Great Famine that followed from 1315 to 1317 was so bad that chroniclers describe people digging up graves and eating leather shoes boiled into a sad, chewy soup. And that was just the start. The Little Ice Age wasn't constant misery. It came in waves, with temperatures dipping especially low every few decades. But the overall trend was clear. Longer, crueler winters. Rivers that used to flow freely froze over. Crops failed in cycles. Even the wine grapes in England, once a brag-worthy point of pride, gave up completely. And if you can't grow grapes, let's be honest, something's gone terribly wrong. One of the oddest side effects? Entire industries bloomed from the cold. Enter the frost fair. Imagine the Thames River in London frozen so solid that enterprising Londoners decided, hey, what if we just held a street festival on top of it? And they did. The river froze deep enough to host open-air markets, puppet shows, dancing, and even temporary printing presses. You could literally buy a souvenir that read, "Printed on the frozen Thames, 1684. It's like Etsy, but with more hypothermia." Still, for all the quirky frost fairs and charming images of people ice skating in fur-lined cloaks, the broader picture was less cheerful. Crops across Europe consistently underperformed, peasants starved, the price of bread soared, and every failed harvest was like a slow domino tipping toward unrest. Hungry people get mad, and mad people tend to light things on fire. Scholars today still debate the cause of the Little Ice Age. Some say it was driven by reduced solar activity, particularly during a period called the Maunder Minimum from 1645 to 1715, when sunspot activity basically flatlined. Others argue it was exacerbated by volcanic activity, with eruptions like Iceland's Lakey in 1783 pumping sulfur into the air and acting like a planetary sunblock. Some even suggest that massive reforestation after Black Death pandemics absorbed more carbon dioxide and subtly cooled the planet. The thing is, there's no single smoking gun. It's more like a gloomy symphony of natural causes all playing in unison. The sun dims a bit, a few volcanoes belch ash, the ocean currents shuffle like they're in a bad mood, and suddenly your medieval village is scraping frost off your goat. You're in Germany in the mid-1600s now. The winter seems to stretch forever. The river behind your cottage has become a road. Horses pull sleds over it. Your neighbour's child hasn't spoken in days. Too cold. The family pig died in the night from exposure. And you? You're considering moving south, anywhere south, but the roads are impassable, and even if you could leave, where would you go? Everyone's cold, everyone's desperate, and no one has enough soup. There's this uneasy rhythm to life during the Little Ice Age. One good year might come along, a brief reprieve with decent sun and a passable harvest, but it's always followed by another bad one. People learn not to get too comfortable. The stories get darker, the artwork even darker still. Just look at the paintings from this time. Grey skies, skeletal trees, people huddled around fires like survivors of some quiet apocalypse. And yes, it wasn't just Europe. North America felt it too. Native tribes in the northeast reported longer, hungrier winters, and some tribes shifted their territories entirely just to avoid brutal seasonal extremes. In the Andes, freezing temperatures messed with high-altitude farming, leading to food instability. Even the mighty Ottoman Empire saw serious crop failures and famines during the 17th century, leading to internal revolts and political shake-ups. But here's the quirky historical gem tucked into all that suffering. People got creative. Winter survival skills improved. Architecture evolved. Thicker walls, smaller windows, better insulation using everything from straw to manure. Yes, manure. You do what you have to do when your teeth chatter at night and your cat won't come out from under the blanket. And then there's the open debate. Did the Little Ice Age really nearly break civilization? Or are we just over-dramatizing a bad cold front? Some argue it was mostly survivable if you weren't already poor or politically vulnerable. Others insist that its fingerprints are all over history, helping fuel everything from the 30 Years' War to peasant uprisings in China. The truth? Probably a little of both. Climate is the background music of history. You don't always notice it until it starts playing way too loud. You lie in bed, picturing yourself wrapped in a scratchy wool blanket beside a peat-burning stove, trying to remember what a ripe apple tastes like. You can hear the wind outside rattling shutters and whistling through poorly sealed walls. Your breath clouds the air even inside. The fire crackles, then dims. You pull your hat down over your ears, hoping tomorrow won't be colder than today. And hoping that somehow spring hasn't forgotten about you. You shuffle your boots down a cobbled street, breath fogging in front of your face, and suddenly realise something odd. This river next to you, the Thames, it's frozen solid. And not just a thin glaze either. We're talking horses pulling carts across it, children sliding on sleds, and a man selling roasted chestnuts from a barrel fire in the middle of the river. Welcome to London during one of its strangest and chilliest traditions, the Frost Fair. It's the 17th century, and the Little Ice Age is in full passive-aggressive swing. The winters hit harder than usual, especially when a few consecutive years go full Game of Thrones. The Thames, which normally flows through the heart of London like a murky ribbon, slows and finally stills under thick layers of ice. It freezes often enough and hard enough that entire events are thrown right on top of it. Picture a farmer's market meets carnival, meets survival instinct. You walk across the ice carefully, passing a printing press clunking away on a table surrounded by gawking crowds. You can even get a slip of parchment with your name printed on it. Printed on the ice of the Thames, 1684, a literal souvenir of climate chaos. There are puppet shows, bear-baiting pits, because nothing says winter fun like a confused cold bear. Juggler troops, and shivering musicians trying to keep their fingers moving enough to strum out a tune. You even spot a tavern tent reeking of beer and wood smoke, where brave souls drink away their awareness that they're standing on a temporarily solid river. It feels like a strange moment of joy in the cold, a beautiful pause. But behind the scenes, it's not that charming. The very reason these frost fairs are possible is because the cold is wreaking havoc elsewhere. The river doesn't normally freeze, it's tidal and wide and restless, but changes in climate have been pushing winter temperatures well below freezing for weeks at a time. Add to that a slower current, thanks to the old London Bridge which weirdly acted like a kind of ice trap, and the water just stops moving. It turns solid, and suddenly you've got yourself a party. A desperate one. This wasn't just a one-off occurrence. Frost fairs happened multiple times between the 17th and early 19th centuries, especially during the coldest decades of the Little Ice Age. The first recorded fair was in 1608, and the last real one took place in 1814. After that, things started warming up again, and engineers redesigned the London Bridge, allowing the Thames to flow more freely and resist freezing. So ironically, climate change and infrastructure teamed up to kill the Frost Fair forever. Progress, I guess. You rub your gloved hands together and make your way to a merchant selling meat pies. They're suspicious. You decide not to ask questions. Behind you, children laugh as they skid across the ice, followed by a very concerned dog. Somewhere off to the right, a group of gamblers plays cards on a makeshift table, using old coins and wood chips as betting tokens. The whole thing feels like an alternate universe, a frozen Venice, a marketplace built on borrowed time. But for many Londoners, this whimsical scene was a distraction from real hardship. These winters were brutal. The poor frozen alleyways, coal prices skyrocketed, chimneys choked with soot. Frost crept up the inside of windows in even the richest houses, and ink froze in inkwells. The cold wasn't just inconvenient, it was deadly. And if the ice held for long enough, people got creative, hence the fairs. There's even a fringe theory among modern historians that the frost fairs may have helped spread early ideas of democracy and rebellion. Weird, right? But think about it. This was one of the rare occasions where people of all classes mingled freely. On the ice, the barriers between rich and poor blurred a little. You could have a duke sipping mulled wine 10 feet from a chimney sweep trying to sell second-hand mittens. Temporary equality, courtesy of frozen chaos. And then there's the big debate. How cold really was it? Some argue that Londoners exaggerated the cold in their writings and art, that maybe it wasn't so much the temperature as it was the specific conditions, like the old bridge bottlenecking the flow or a particularly snowy year. Others point to records of frozen ports, icebound livestock, and meteorological journals to say, nope, it was legit Arctic out there. And when you see those souvenir prints, crude woodcuts of carousels and tents on the river, it's hard not to believe they were just documenting the bizarre reality around them. But there's something almost romantic about it too. Not the frostbite, obviously, but the way people leaned into it. When life gives you a frozen river, you make money, or music, or memories, or at least you try. Humans are annoyingly good at that. Give them a catastrophe and a patch of solid ground, or in this case, ice, and they'll build a fair, hand out pies, and print newspapers on it like it's just another Tuesday. The frost fairs slowly faded as the planet began its tentative warm-up in the 19th century. They became stories people told their grandchildren. Back in my day, the river turned to stone and we danced on it. A little hard to believe now, standing on a modern, fast-flowing Thames, all business and bustle. But somewhere beneath the surface, if you could scrape away a few centuries, you'd find footprints, boot marks, sled tracks, maybe even the broken handle of a puppet stage, abandoned when the thaw came too fast. You return to your warm bed now, the image of a frozen London still fresh in your mind. Candles flicker in the corners of memory. A fire crackles from a barrel in the snow. Children laugh across centuries, and you can almost hear the creak of ice beneath your feet. History isn't always warm, but sometimes, even in the coldest stretches, it manages to glow. Now let's head east, way east. It's 1812, and you're trudging through the snow somewhere in what should have been a victorious parade through Russia, only instead of cheers and triumph, you're freezing your face off, your boots are falling apart, and you're starting to wonder whether conquering Moscow was worth all this frostbite. Welcome to Napoleon's Russian nightmare, also known as one of the most disastrous winter retreats in military history. If history had a blooper reel, this one would be the slow-motion faceplant that never ends. You're part of Napoleon's Grande Armée, and at the start of the campaign things looked promising. I mean, sure, marching hundreds of thousands of men into the vast, rugged wilderness of Russia was ambitious. Okay, arrogant. But that was Napoleon's whole thing. He was the man with the golden hat and the audacity to match. By mid-1812, over 600,000 troops from all across Europe had followed him into Russia. The biggest army Europe had ever seen. That's not hyperbole, it's a statistical horror. But here's the thing. Russia didn't exactly roll out the red carpet. Instead of giving Napoleon a traditional battlefield, the Russian forces just retreated. Over and over. Scorched earth tactics. They burned their own towns, slaughtered their own livestock, and basically said, if we can't eat it, neither can you. And Napoleon, ever the egomaniac, kept going deeper. By the time he reached Moscow in September, the city was empty. And then it burst into flames. As in literal flames, burned down by its own citizens. Imagine arriving at your enemy's capital expecting glory and getting a ghost town with a side of arson. You stand there, smoke thick in your throat, your coat already too thin for the chill that's creeping in. You think, We should probably turn back now. But Napoleon waits for the Russians to surrender, but they don't. The first snowflakes fall, and then winter hits. And it's not just any winter, it's a brutal Russian winter, with bone-snapping cold that even the locals complain about. By the time the retreat begins, the army's already in rough shape. Supplies are low, horses are dying en masse, roads are blocked with snowdrifts and frozen corpses. The temperature drops to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Your fingers stop bending. Your ears are numb. Your friend falls asleep in the snow and doesn't wake up. Another comrade eats a leather belt. Someone else eats. Someone. You don't ask questions anymore. Here's your historical fact. Of the 600,000 soldiers who entered Russia, only about 100,000 made it out, and many of those were permanently disabled, disfigured, or psychologically broken. It was one of the most catastrophic military failures in recorded history, not just because of Russian resistance, but because the weather did most of the killing. Napoleon later admitted, "The cold killed us. Not gunfire, not swords, just ice and hubris." The weird part, this wasn't even the worst Russian winter on record. There were colder ones, but this particular winter arrived early and fast, and the Grande Armée was completely unprepared. Their uniforms were designed for fashionable marching, not survival. Their supply lines, too long and too chaotic. Their food, frozen solid or gone. And their enemy, suddenly very patient. Now here's a fun fringe fact. Russian folklore holds that General Winter is a real force of nature, basically a sentient frost spirit who defends the motherland from invaders, and to be fair, history kind of backs that up. It wasn't just Napoleon who got frost-slapped. Hitler's army tried the same stunt in 1941 and ran into almost the exact same problem. Snow, ice, and a Russian resistance that knew how to play the long game. But back to you, limping along some forest road near Smolensk. You wrap your scarf tighter and step over a horse carcass. The air stings your lungs. You haven't eaten in 2 days. Your musket is frozen shut. You hear wolves in the distance. Again, you're too tired to care. The only thing driving you forward is the grim hope of escape, of survival, of not being added to the long list of soldiers who came to conquer and ended up buried in snow. Napoleon eventually abandoned his men and rode back to Paris, said he had business to attend to. The survivors of the campaign straggled home, if they were lucky, with frostbitten limbs and 1,000-yard stares. France never fully recovered. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility shattered, and Europe, sensing blood in the snow, began sharpening its knives. The scholarly debate here is a fascinating one. Was Napoleon's failure inevitable? Did he underestimate Russian strategy, or did he truly believe he could outpace the climate? Some argue it wasn't the winter alone, but a culmination of poor logistics, broken morale, and blind ambition. Others point out that if Moscow hadn't burned, Napoleon might have been able to winter there and change the outcome entirely. But as it stands, the cold was the tipping point. History may have been written by men, but this chapter, it was written by frost. You roll onto your side in bed now, your pillow cool against your cheek, and think about how strange it is that something so soft, snow after all is just frozen water, can break an army. How silence and cold and emptiness can defeat flags and horses and cannon fire. You shiver a little, but just from the thought. You pull the blanket tighter, safe, for now, from the kind of winter that swallows entire dreams. It's one thing to freeze in the middle of a foreign invasion, miles from home and surrounded by enemies. It's a whole different kind of cold when you're just trying to win your country's freedom, and winter decides it hates you too. Tonight you're not marching through Russia. You're holed up in a snowy Pennsylvania forest in 1777, with frozen mud up to your ankles and the faint smell of gunpowder lingering in the air. Welcome to Valley Forge, the American Revolution's most famously miserable winter retreat, where frostbite was more common than bullets, and surviving until breakfast counted as a victory. You're a soldier in the Continental Army, and by soldier, we mean probably underfed, underclothed, and definitely underpaid. You've got one threadbare coat between 3 guys, a pair of socks with more holes than fabric, and boots that are more decorative than functional at this point. The snow is stained with blood, but not from a battle. It's from your own feet. Washington's army has camped here through the winter of 1777 to 78, after a string of frustrating losses, including the capture of Philadelphia by British forces. Morale? Pretty low. Supplies? Laughably bad. The army's more or less holding itself together with hope and a lot of stubbornness. It's freezing, it's damp, and people are dying. Not in glorious battlefield ways, but slowly, from disease, malnutrition, and the cold that creeps into your chest and just stays. Historical fact time. Roughly 2,000 men died that winter, mostly from dysentery, typhoid, pneumonia, and yes, the cold. Valley Forge wasn't a death camp, but it was certainly a test of endurance. If you could make it through that winter, you could survive anything, probably even modern taxes. Now let's paint the scene. Your hut is barely finished. The logs leak wind, the roof leaks water, and there's a single thread of smoke from a tiny fire pit that chokes you more than it warms you. You're sitting with 5 other soldiers, eating what might be boiled shoe leather, again, and trying not to think about how far away spring feels. It's hard to imagine freedom when you can't feel your toes. Then something changes. A weird, prickly man with a strong German accent arrives at camp, Baron von Steuben, an ex-Prussian officer with a flair for swearing in multiple languages and a surprising gift for discipline. He immediately begins drilling the troops, teaching real tactics, and whipping the Continental Army into something resembling a professional force. It's the makeover montage of the American Revolution, except instead of haircuts and shopping sprees, it's marching drills and bayonet practice in the snow. Here's the quirky detail. Von Steuben didn't speak English fluently, so he would swear at the soldiers in French and German, and his aides would translate the curses into English. Imagine being cold, hungry, and then getting yelled at in 3 languages for not holding your musket properly. Motivation through multilingual sass. And somehow it works. The soldiers respond, they learn, they improve. What starts as a half-dead militia emerges from Valley Forge in the spring as a real fighting force. Better organised, better trained, and thanks to some late arriving supplies, better clothed. The suffering hadn't been in vain. The army that limped into Valley Forge is not the one that marches out. The scholarly debate around Valley Forge is a nuanced one. Some historians argue that the suffering has been over-romanticised, used to build the mythology of the American Revolution. Others insist it was absolutely as bad as the stories say, perhaps even worse in the quiet moments between battles, where men stared into campfires and wondered if they'd made a terrible mistake. And the truth probably lies somewhere in between. The suffering was real, but so was the transformation. You imagine yourself now, wrapped in a blanket that smells like ash and sweat, staring into the fire in your crude log hut. Your hands are cracked, your stomach's been empty since yesterday, and your comrade next to you is coughing in that way that makes your heart sink. But outside you hear footsteps. Drill practice again. You groan, but you get up. You grab your musket, what's left of it, and join the line. Because this isn't just about you. This is about something bigger than frozen feet and bad stew. This is about proving to the world that a ragtag army of farmers, blacksmiths and fishermen can face down the most powerful empire on earth and not freeze into irrelevance. And somehow, it all holds together. The soldiers who survive Valley Forge go on to fight in pivotal battles like Monmouth and eventually Yorktown. And though the war drags on for years, that winter becomes a turning point, not because of a great victory, but because the army simply didn't fall apart. They endured. That's the thing about winter in history. It doesn't always kill you quickly. Sometimes it just erodes you, bit by bit, whispering doubts into your ears while you huddle against the cold. And still, some people rise, against all odds. You roll over under your warm covers now, reminded just how luxurious central heating really is. You don't have to wrap rags around your feet or dig a latrine through frozen dirt at 4 a.m. You're not rationing powdered flour or worrying whether the guy 2 bunks over is going to infect you with something unpronounceable. But for the soldiers at Valley Forge, that was life. That was winter. That was history shaped by sheer, stubborn survival. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we remember it. Now picture yourself on the other side of the world. You're walking through the narrow stone streets of Beijing, your breath visible in the air, your fingers stinging despite the silk-lined gloves you paid way too much for. It's early winter, sometime in the mid-1600s, and everything feels off. There's no snow on the ground yet, but the sky is a leaden grey, and there's this tense, brittle silence hanging in the air. You're living in the final years of the Ming dynasty, and whether you know it or not, your empire's about to collapse, and the cold is one of the culprits. Here's the deal. By the 1640s, the Ming were already limping. Plague outbreaks, peasant uprisings, corruption, Mongol incursions. Pick your poison. But then, as if the dynasty hadn't already pulled the short straw, nature decided to twist the knife. China, just like Europe, was deep in the clutches of the Little Ice Age. Colder winters, shorter growing seasons, weird weather patterns, and millions of mouths to feed. You walk through a market that's half empty. The grain seller is charging triple what he did last year. A family nearby is arguing over the price of a cabbage. A beggar kid follows you for 2 blocks before giving up. This isn't just a bad season, it's turning into a slow-motion economic implosion. Historical fact time. During the last few decades of the Ming Dynasty, climate anomalies caused widespread crop failures, especially in the densely populated northern provinces. Famines swept through the countryside. The Yellow River flooded again, displacing thousands, and when it wasn't flooding, it was freezing. Locusts devoured what few crops did grow. It felt like every elemental force had turned against you. And in China, where dynasties were believed to rule under the mandate of heaven, a run of natural disasters was more than unlucky. It was a cosmic sign that the rulers had lost divine favour. So people began looking for someone new to take the wheel. Enter Li Zicheng, a peasant-turned-rebel who led a large-scale uprising fueled by hunger, desperation, and frustration with Ming leadership. His slogan might as well have been, "If they can't feed us, they can't rule us." And honestly, it was hard to argue. By 1644, Li had stormed the capital, Beijing, with shocking speed. The Ming emperor, realizing the jig was up, committed suicide in a garden behind the Forbidden City. Just like that, the dynasty that had ruled for nearly 3 centuries vanished into history. But wait, plot twist. The new rebel regime didn't last long either. The Ming had previously invited Manchu soldiers from the north to help with defense, and well, the Manchus saw their opening. They rolled in, pushed Li out, and founded the Qing dynasty, which would go on to rule until the early 20th century. So yes, the climate didn't just break crops, it cracked governments. And here's your quirky fringe fact. Some Chinese scholars of the era wrote that the rivers were freezing too early, before autumn was even finished. In some provinces, people reported snow in summer and sunless skies, eerily similar to what we now associate with massive volcanic activity or prolonged solar minimums. Was it a fluke of weather or a full-blown climate pattern? Modern scientists are still debating that. One prevailing theory is that the global climate was impacted by not one, but several eruptions throughout the 17th century, including the massive eruption of Mount Parker in the Philippines in 1641, just 3 years before the Ming fell. Combine that with the Maunder minimum, that eerie period of minimal sunspots, and you've got a deadly combination: colder winters, poor harvests, and political instability. As you walk through the hushed city streets now, you can feel the anxiety in the air. The emperor's banners still fly, but fewer people bow when they pass. The food riots have grown bolder. Some government offices are simply empty. The bureaucracy, so famously sprawling and ironclad, has started to vanish. Local magistrates can't enforce anything. Grain reserves, gone. Tax collectors, hiding. The empire is crumbling like a cracked porcelain bowl left out in the frost too long. And this isn't just a China problem. Across Asia, the same pattern appears. Colder weather, crop failures, rebellion. In Japan, famines linked to cold spells also sparked social unrest. In India, the Mughal Empire faced both droughts and freezing winters that strained its once mighty infrastructure. Climate instability doesn't recognise borders, it just sweeps across the map, flattening anything unprepared. The big scholarly debate around this period is how much weight we can place on climate in the fall of the Ming. Some historians argue it was only one piece of the puzzle, that corruption, war and bad luck were just as critical. Others point to ice core data, harvest records, and anecdotal accounts of extreme weather to say, nope, this was climate collapse 101. And again, the truth likely sits somewhere in between. Human systems are fragile, but they're also complex. Sometimes all it takes is a little freeze at the wrong moment to tip the whole structure over. You crawl into your pile of winter bedding now, thick cotton quilts, a stone brazier flickering quietly in the corner, and try to sleep. Outside, wind rushes through the alleys of Beijing like a ghost. You can hear something creaking, maybe a shutter or maybe something bigger. You pull the covers over your head, half expecting to wake up in a different dynasty. Because in the bitter winters of the 17th century, it wasn't just people that broke under the cold. Whole empires shattered like thin ice. The wind howls outside your shuttered window, shaking the panes like a drunk trying to find the keyhole. You think it's just another storm, another winter squall rumbling through your little European village. But this one's different. It's January 1709, and by the time you open the door you realise something's terribly wrong. The air slices into your lungs like knives. The sky is clear, but the cold is not normal. You step into the street and everything is still. Frozen. Silent in a way that feels unnatural, like the world has been placed in a snow globe and abandoned. Welcome to the Great Frost of 1709, a winter so intense it blanketed Europe in record-breaking cold and nearly collapsed the fragile balance between survival and chaos. And no, we're not exaggerating. This was the coldest European winter in at least 500 years, possibly even longer. The kind of winter that turns rivers into roads and turns peasants into statistics. Historical records across the continent are crystal clear. If a little frostbitten, the temperature dropped and simply refused to come back up. In France, the thermometer hit minus 15 degrees Celsius, 5 degrees Fahrenheit in Paris, unheard of at the time. For 2 solid weeks, the sun rose on a world that didn't thaw. Not a puddle, not a breath of warmth. Trees split down the middle with explosive cracks. Wine froze in bottles. Birds fell mid-flight like tiny feathered meteorites. Even the sea iced over along some coastlines. The earth didn't just catch a chill, it entered a state of suspended animation. And France? Oh, France suffered. You're there now, trudging through snowbanks in threadbare wool, heading to the bakery even though you already know what's waiting, an empty shelf and a long line of gaunt faces. Wheat crops had failed the previous season due to wet weather, and the frost only made things worse. What little flour remained was being hoarded or sold at scandalous prices. Some bakers shut down completely, others watered down their dough and still ran out before midday. You pass a group of children warming their hands over a pot of coals. A man nearby mutters about eating his dog. You hope he's joking, but you've heard stories. In fact, you've seen things over the past few days that you'll never tell anyone. Desperation wears many faces. Here's your historical fact. France lost an estimated 600,000 people that winter, and in the famine that followed. That's roughly 2% of the population, wiped out not by war or disease, but by cold and hunger. Entire villages emptied. The roads were littered with beggars and corpses. In some towns, locals were paid to dig mass graves. The ground was so frozen they used fire to soften it before digging, and the rest of Europe didn't fare much better. In Scandinavia, livestock froze to death in barns. In Italy, the canals of Venice froze solid. In Germany and Austria, food riots broke out. And in England, the River Thames froze again, but this time no one felt like throwing a party on it. Frost fairs weren't fun when you had to choose between freezing and starving. Now for a quirky, if not slightly unsettling fact. Some weather observers at the time believed the freeze was a divine punishment. In Catholic France, preachers blamed moral decay and spiritual weakness. In Protestant Germany, it was seen as a test of faith. A few very imaginative thinkers even blamed comets, which makes sense if your science curriculum was mostly fire and brimstone. Meanwhile, actual scientists today point to a few possible culprits. One is the continued Maunder minimum, that mysterious period of minimal solar activity that seemed to stretch on forever. With fewer sunspots, the sun's energy output was lower, causing a subtle but widespread drop in temperatures across the northern hemisphere. On top of that, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 1707 may have added a bit of ash to the atmosphere, just enough to help tip the scales into a deep freeze. But it's not a closed case. Scholars still debate whether these events alone can account for the extremity of 1709. Some suggest shifts in oceanic circulation may have played a role. Others argue that the compound effects of deforestation, agricultural shifts, and even post-plague demographic changes all contributed in their own weird ways. Climate, it seems, is never just about the weather. So here you are, back in 1709, in a small stone house with a fire that refuses to stay lit, and food that barely qualifies as food. You wrap yourself in every scrap of cloth you can find, including a tapestry from your wall that smells like mildew and regret. Your neighbour hasn't been seen in days. You heard his roof collapsed under the snow. The church bells ring out not for a wedding or a festival, but for the dead. 3 times today already. You've stopped counting. Your cat sleeps on your chest at night, more for warmth than affection. You don't blame her. You've done things you wouldn't have considered last year. You've burned books, family heirlooms, furniture. Anything to feed the fire which gives back so little. You look out the window and the entire world is still frozen. It's like time has stopped, a white purgatory, and yet, slowly, the frost does begin to loosen. By March, the ice starts to melt. By April, you hear the first birdsong, trees bud reluctantly, a few green shoots poke through the soil, but the damage has been done. Families are gone, fields are barren, and in the back of everyone's mind is the same uneasy thought. Could it happen again? You roll over in bed now, listening to the hum of your heater and the quiet comfort of a world with thermostats. Outside, maybe it's cold, but nothing like 1709 cold. Not the kind that freezes ink in pens and locks rivers in silence. You can't help but wonder what it would have felt like, looking at a sky so clear and feeling no warmth, just endless, hollow cold. And knowing there's nowhere to go but forward, slowly, carefully, through snow that doesn't care who you are or what you've lost. You're standing on a shoreline that doesn't belong to you, not in the way we usually think of belonging. It's Greenland, and the sea wind cuts like a knife down the back of your neck. Behind you are turf houses, half buried in snow. Seals hang drying from wooden racks, and your breath puffs out in tiny clouds. The ice has crept closer to the settlement again, tighter than last winter. You're a Norse settler, maybe one of the last, and things aren't looking great. This is the story of the Vikings in Greenland, a civilization that held on for centuries in one of the harshest environments imaginable, until winter finally whispered, enough. The Norse came to Greenland around the year 985, led by Eric the Red. Yes, that Eric, the exiled one with the killer marketing skills who convinced people to settle an icy wasteland by calling it Greenland. Bold move, and it worked. For a while. For the first couple hundred years, the Norse settlements in Greenland were surprisingly successful. They raised livestock, grew some hardy barley, traded with Iceland and Norway, and even built churches with carved stone and imported timber. You can still see the ruins today, silent structures buried in frost. These people weren't savages in fur boots. They were medieval farmers with bishops and taxes and sermons and seasonal fish feasts. But starting around the 1300s, things began to shift. The Little Ice Age crept in slowly, like frost along the inside of a window, until one day it wasn't just a colder year, it was a colder century. Sea ice thickened around Greenland's coast, cutting off trade routes. The growing season shortened, meaning less grass for livestock, less hay for the long winters. Herds started to die. People started to leave, or die with them. Here's your historical fact. The Norse settlements in Greenland, at their height, home to over 2,000 people, vanished by the late 1400s. The last written record we have is from 1408, a marriage ceremony at the Church of Valsey. After that, silence. No letters, no trade receipts, no shipwrecks. Just gone. And here's the really eerie part. The Inuit, who had arrived in Greenland centuries earlier from the north, survived just fine. While the Norse struggled with failing crops and dying cows, the Inuit hunted seals and whales and built homes adapted for deep cold. They knew how to live with the ice. The Norse tried to fight it. They clung to their cows and Christian churches and imported ways of life. And the ice didn't care. You're there now, wrapped in a wool cloak that used to belong to someone stronger, walking past a field of bone-thin sheep. The fjord is frozen almost all the way across. No ship is coming. Not this year. Probably not next year either. You know it. Everyone knows it. The bishop's been dead for 3 winters. The last boat from Iceland never returned. Supplies are low. The fish aren't biting. Some families are packing up what little they have and heading inland toward nothing. There's an ongoing debate among scholars about what exactly caused the collapse of the Norse Greenlanders. Was it the worsening climate alone? Was it isolation? Was it a failure to adapt? Or maybe it was all of those things, plus a dash of cultural stubbornness. Some suggest they could have learned from the Inuit how to hunt seals more efficiently, how to build igloos, how to survive like the land wanted them to. But the Norse saw themselves as European farmers, not Arctic nomads. They built cathedrals instead of learning kayak building. They made butter while the world froze around them. And maybe that's the strangest part, this quiet refusal to change. The Greenland Norse weren't wiped out in one dramatic battle. There was no plague, no volcanic eruption, no conquest. Just year after year of winters that stretched longer, bit harder, and gave back less. A slow, quiet fade. No one thought to write a final letter. No one had the parchment or the ink anyway. You walk down to the water's edge, where the ice has formed strange ridges, like pale ribs. You think of the seal meat stored in the stone cellar. It won't be enough. You think of the church, half covered in snow, its bells silent. You wonder if it will all be buried one day, and if anyone will even remember you were here. Quirky fact. Some of the Norse burials from Greenland show signs of scurvy, a disease of deficiency caused by a lack of fresh food, particularly vitamin C. Which is deeply ironic, considering they lived surrounded by Inuit people who were eating raw seal meat, rich in exactly the nutrients the Norse lacked. They literally starved while their neighbours thrived. It makes you think about how civilizations end, not always with a bang, sometimes with the slow tightening of the cold, with a family saying, "We'll try one more year," and that year never ends. And then, centuries later, someone stumbles across your bones in the permafrost, or a carved piece of wood, or the crumbled corner of a stone church, and they ask, why did they stay? Why didn't they change? And you, if you could speak from the ice, might say, we tried, we hoped, we believed spring would return. You pull your blanket tighter around you tonight, reminded again of just how warm your bed is, how far removed from the world of seal oil lamps and frozen fjords. But you can still feel the chill, can't you? The quiet dread of a people who kept waiting for a thaw that never came. You're standing at the edge of a river that doesn't know how to move anymore. The mighty Mississippi, the artery of a continent, has frozen over, solid, silent, and still. It's January 1918, and you're in the middle of what locals call the Big Freeze, a brutal cold snap that gripped the central United States like a frostbitten hand and squeezed until everything cracked. The wind carries no sound, just pressure, like it's holding its breath with you. Somewhere behind you, a horse's breath curls into the air like smoke, and the trees creak like old bones. This was the winter when even the Mississippi froze, from Iowa to Illinois to Missouri. You probably don't think about that river freezing. It doesn't freeze now. It barely pauses in its march to the Gulf of Mexico. But in the early months of 1918, it turned to ice thick enough for people to walk across. A river that usually carried barges and paddle boats turned into a glassy plain of quiet. People skated on it, drove wagons across it. Someone even pitched a tent on it because why not? But it wasn't just the novelty of a frozen river. It was everything else. The winter of 1917 to 1918 was one of the coldest in modern US history, and it couldn't have come at a worse time. World War I was still raging. The Spanish flu was just months from sweeping through towns like an invisible firestorm. And right now, just surviving the weather felt like its own private war. You're in St. Louis. The snow has stopped, but it left behind 4 feet of silence. The temperature hovers around minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit in parts of the Midwest, which is so cold that your spit freezes before it hits the ground. Trains are immobilized, coal is running out, pipes burst like champagne bottles on New Year's, except no one's celebrating. You try to start a car, but the engine groans like it's dying and then gives up completely. You don't blame it. The cold wave of 1918 didn't just affect the Mississippi Valley. It tore across the United States like a glacier with a grudge, hitting New England, the South, and the Pacific Northwest with equal cruelty. Record lows were recorded in dozens of cities. Frozen livestock piled up in fields. Water mains snapped like twigs. The Great Lakes were so ice-covered that shipping nearly stopped. Entire towns became marooned in their own frost-covered isolation. Here's your historical fact. The Mississippi River has only frozen solid a handful of times in recorded history. 1918 was one of them. People in Memphis walked across it. In Davenport, Iowa, a train was delayed for days after becoming frozen to the tracks. This wasn't a one-day freak event. The freeze lasted for weeks, and the damage wasn't just measured in degrees, it was in dollars, deaths, and disruption. Now for something quirky. One of the oddest stories from that winter comes from Washington, D.C., where the freezing temperatures were so severe that the Potomac River iced over too. City officials were forced to cut large holes in the ice just to maintain access to emergency water reserves. And the people? They made the best of it. Ice skating on the reflecting pool, bundled in every coat they owned, trying to look cheerful as their boots leaked and their breath crystallized on their eyelashes. But the Midwest bore the worst of it. Cities like Des Moines, Omaha, and Minneapolis, endured weeks where temperatures never climbed above zero. Schools closed. Churches held services in freezing sanctuaries with no heat. Businesses shuttered, not for a snow day, but because no one could get there alive. And if you were poor, you just tried not to die. The Red Cross distributed blankets in Chicago, bread lines grew, emergency shelters overflowed, and here's where things get even darker. All of this happened against the backdrop of a nation at war. Soldiers at training camps in the Midwest drilled in sub-zero temperatures. Letters home spoke of numb fingers and barracks filled with smoke from overworked stoves. In Kansas, at Fort Riley, the bitter cold was blamed for a strange uptick in illness, something that wouldn't be named for a few more months: influenza. It's morbid to think about, but the winter of 1918 didn't just freeze the land. It may have helped incubate one of the deadliest pandemics in history. There's debate among historians and climatologists about the exact cause of the 1918 cold wave. Was it just a statistical outlier? A freak alignment of Arctic air masses and jet stream dips? Or was it a ripple effect from volcanic activity earlier in the decade? The data's muddy, but what's clear is that it was one of the most intense winters the US had ever endured, and it left scars that weren't just frostbite. Back on the frozen Mississippi, you test the ice with your heel. It doesn't even crack. It feels thick enough to hold a house. In fact, a few towns built makeshift ice bridges to ferry goods and people across, cheaper than running a ferry boat. Children played hockey on it. Adults kept an eye on the horizon, praying the thaw wouldn't come too suddenly. Because when the Mississippi unfreezes, it tends to do it with flair. Ice floes the size of cars break loose and crush whatever's unlucky enough to be in their path. You head home, your face numb, your coat dusted with powdery snow. Inside, the stove is barely keeping up. You put another lump of coal in and curse how expensive it's gotten. You read in the newspaper that city officials are rationing heat and electricity. You pull on a second pair of socks and pray the pipes don't burst again tonight. And somehow you endure. You wake up the next morning and it's still cold. The river's still frozen. The world hasn't melted yet, but you're still breathing, still moving, still waiting for spring. You lie in your modern bed now, sheets soft, heating hum barely noticeable. You've never had to walk across a frozen river to get to work or boil water from the kitchen tap because the pipes exploded. But deep down, you know the cold that broke across the land in 1918 wasn't just about weather. It was a reminder of how fragile comfort really is, and how fast it can vanish beneath the ice. You're standing in a narrow Parisian alley, wrapped in whatever threadbare fabric you can layer without looking like a walking laundry pile. The smoke from chimney stacks clings low to the ground, curling around your ankles like it's too tired to rise. It's winter, 1788, and France is gripped in the icy jaws of one of the coldest seasons it's seen in living memory. You don't know it yet, but this miserable freeze is one of the final nails in the coffin for the French monarchy. The powder keg is already packed. The fuse? It's made of frost. Let's set the scene. The winter of 1788 to 89 was so severe that the Seine River froze over. Again. Roads became impassable. Trees exploded from the cold. Wine froze in the barrels. People were burning furniture for heat. And the food? Let's just say if you weren't already a bread thief, you were seriously thinking about becoming one. In a country where most people already spent half their income on food, skyrocketing prices during the frost turned discomfort into full-blown desperation. Historical fact incoming. Grain crops had been in trouble for a while leading up to this brutal winter. First came droughts, then torrential rains, and then just as farmers hoped for a better harvest, bam! This epic freeze hit. The harvest failed. Again. With no grain, there was no bread. With no bread, there was no peace. The price of flour doubled. In some regions, it tripled. Riots broke out. Bakeries were stormed. And all of this just months before the storming of the Bastille. It's hard to overstate how much weather fed the flames of revolution. Louis XVI was many things, but he couldn't control the sky. He called for reforms. He convened the Estates General, hoping a little political manoeuvring could calm the public. But people weren't interested in procedure. They were cold. They were hungry. They wanted change, not debate. You picture yourself now, shoulder to shoulder with a crowd outside a bakery. A cart of bread arrives and the scene immediately turns ugly. There's no line, just chaos. Elbows, shouts, fists. A mother screams as her child is trampled in the scuffle. A man pulls a knife. The baker is already locking the door, shouting that there's nothing left. You don't even taste the crust you fought for. It's gone before you know it. And here's the quirky historical twist. That same winter also froze the fountains at Versailles. Picture that. Ornate marble basins and golden cherubs entombed in ice, while the peasants in the cities scraped together firewood and whispered about revolution. You could walk through the royal gardens and see everything frozen in time, beauty trapped in silence. Some nobles hosted sleigh rides around the palace, wrapped in fur cloaks, sipping warm spiced wine. The contrast was obscene, and people noticed. Then comes spring. Not the lovely blooming kind, the kind that melts snow and floods streets, that turns slush into mud, the kind that stinks, rotting food, stagnant water, disease. In the countryside, livestock carcasses thaw where they fell. In the cities, sewage backs up as the thaw clogs ancient drains. There's no relief, only more misery. By the summer of 1789, the people of France had been pushed to the edge, not just by ideology, but by ice. When the Bastille fell on July 14th, the air was hot, but the revolution had already been chilling for years. You might not think of climate as revolutionary, but it absolutely is. It doesn't need slogans, it doesn't need torches, just enough bad weather at the wrong time, and even the sturdiest thrones start to crack. There's still debate among scholars about just how much the hunger winter of 1788 to 89 contributed to the French Revolution. Some say it was the final straw, others argue it was just one variable in a long decline. But there's no question that cold made everything worse. Tightened the screws on a system already rusted and groaning. It didn't cause the revolution, but it lit the fire under it. Or maybe, more accurately, it froze the people into movement. You return now to your tiny stone apartment in the heart of Paris, watching your breath curl in the candlelight. You wrap your shawl tighter, you cough. There's frost on the inside of the window, and the bread you bought 3 days ago is hard enough to injure someone. Still, it's all you've got. The streets are quieter now, tense, like something's about to break. Everyone feels it. The wind, the hunger, the rumours. Something's coming. And then it does. The revolution erupts, heads roll, crowds flood the streets. Cold has given way to heat, political heat, social heat, literal fire. The monarchy doesn't survive the winter, not really. It dies in the spring, but its death warrant was signed when people started choosing between starvation and sedition. And here's the chilling question. Was this all inevitable? Would the revolution have come even without the frost and famine? Some historians say yes. The Enlightenment was already stoking flames, but others argue that ideas don't move masses. Hunger does. Philosophy never stirred a mob. Empty stomachs did. You roll over in bed now, imagining the wind rattling loose shutters on a stone house somewhere in rural France. The quiet desperation of a mother watching her children sleep under too thin blankets. History doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers through the cracks in the wall, through the draft under the door, reminding you that change doesn't always come with banners, but it always comes, especially when winter overstays its welcome. The sky is so blindingly white it almost hurts to look at. The wind doesn't whistle, it screams, funneling between snow-drenched mountains like a banshee let loose from some frozen purgatory. You've lost count of how many days it's been snowing. You're not sure what day it is at all, honestly. The calendar doesn't matter anymore. There's only before the storm and after. You're with the Donner Party, trapped in the Sierra Nevada, and winter is about to teach you just how cruel it can get when ambition outruns caution. You never thought it would come to this. Back in spring, you were optimistic. Naive, even. A covered wagon, a good horse, a few strong backs, and a promise of green fields in California. The American dream, but dustier. The journey west was supposed to be long, yes, but manageable. People had done it before. What could go wrong? Spoiler everything. Here's your historical fact. In 1846, a group of around 87 pioneers set out from Illinois to California. They left late in the season, took a supposedly faster but untested shortcut known as the Hastings Cutoff, and ended up months behind schedule. When the Sierra Nevada mountains loomed ahead of them in October, they were already tired, underfed, and bickering. They were 20 miles from safety. Just 20. But that's when the snow came, and it didn't stop. By early November, the group was completely trapped. Snow piled up in drifts 20 feet high. Their wagons were stuck. Their cattle died. Trees snapped under the weight, and with each passing day, hope became thinner than the bark soup they were boiling for dinner. You imagine yourself inside one of their makeshift cabins, really just a log pile with a roof that leaks snow. The cold is not just outside, it's inside your bones. The fire flickers low. Your stomach feels like it's folding in on itself. People have stopped talking much. Eyes are hollow, cheeks are sunken. A few children have died, a few adults too. You don't ask who's next, you just try not to be. And then comes the part history never lets you forget. The cannibalism. It didn't start immediately, it wasn't taken lightly. But when weeks turned into months and there was nothing left, no game to hunt, no livestock, no bark, no leather, it happened. Survivors later said it wasn't murder, it was necessity. They waited until someone died naturally. Then they made the unthinkable decision to do what they had to do to stay alive. It's horrifying. It's also deeply human. When you're facing death by starvation in sub-zero temperatures, the rules of society melt away a lot faster than the snow ever will. Here's your quirky fringe fact. At least one member of the Donner Party, a German immigrant named Louis Kesselberg, was later accused of actually enjoying the cannibalism. Whether that's true or just a cruel bit of scapegoating is still debated. After the rescue, Kesselberg sued his accusers for defamation and won a small settlement. But for the rest of his life, people whispered behind his back, "That's the man who ate people." And rescue did come, eventually. But it took 4 separate relief parties, spread out over months to reach everyone. By the time the final survivors were brought out in April 1847, only 48 of the original 87 were still alive. The rest were buried in snowdrifts, or not buried at all. There's a fierce scholarly debate about whether the disaster could have been avoided. Was it really Hastings' fault for recommending that awful shortcut? Was it poor planning, arrogance, bad luck? Or was it just the weather, a brutal early winter that nobody could have seen coming? Some say the snow came early, others argue the party was too slow, too disorganised, too stubborn. And maybe it was all of it. Maybe that's how tragedy works. Not one wrong step, but 10 smaller ones all leading into a storm. You lie in bed now, maybe under 2 or 3 soft blankets, full from dinner, your thermostat quietly humming. But for a moment, you're in that snowy hellscape, watching snowflakes swirl like tiny knives, wondering how long your body can survive on memory alone. You hear the creak of trees above you, the slow drip of melting snow into a pot over a low flame, and the steady silence of people who are too weak to speak. You think about how many times in history cold has not just killed people, but stripped them down to their most primal selves. In cities, frost starves and protests erupt. On battlefields, it claims soldiers by the thousands. But here, in the Sierra Nevada, it isolated. It waited. It pushed a group of hopeful pioneers into the darkest pages of American memory and froze them there, forever. The Donner Party didn't die because they were weak. They died because they were human, caught between geography, hubris, and one of the most unforgiving winters the West had ever seen. And the survivors? They weren't heroes. They weren't villains. They were people who made impossible choices because the cold wouldn't give them any others. And you roll over in bed, the heat from your body trapped comfortably beneath your blankets. No howling wind outside, no bone broth made from actual bones, no 20-foot snowbanks between you and safety. Just a quiet night. And the knowledge that not every winter story ends with a miracle. Sometimes it just ends. You're sitting beside a lake, but it's not the kind you'd swim in. The surface is flat, dark and wind-stirred, with jagged peaks of the Swiss Alps casting long theatrical shadows across the water. There's a strange quiet to the place. Not eerie exactly, just muffled, like the world has been turned down a few notches. You pull your coat tighter. It's supposed to be summer, but you can see your breath. You glance up at the sky. Clouds again. Heavy, sullen, sunless clouds. You're in Geneva in 1816, and this isn't a vacation. It's a Gothic prologue. They'll call it the year without a summer, and you're already familiar with the cause. Mount Tambora erupting in 1815, flinging dust and ash into the atmosphere like confetti from the apocalypse. But here, in this moment, you're not thinking about volcanic ejecta or atmospheric sulfuric aerosols. You're thinking about how miserably cold it is for July. You're thinking about how everyone in the villa is getting a little bit weird, especially Lord Byron. Yes, that Lord Byron. You're in the middle of a now infamous gathering of literary minds, all hiding out from the bone-deep chill and endless rain in a borrowed mansion called Villa Diodati. Byron's brought along his personal physician, John Polidori. Mary Godwin is here too. She hasn't married Percy Shelley yet, but he's here, moody and poetic as always. They read ghost stories to each other by candlelight. They hold seances for fun. The lake, shrouded in mist, stares back blankly. Outside, crops are failing across Europe. In England, starving farmers loot grain carts. In Ireland, the potato crop withers in the frozen ground. In Switzerland, food prices triple, then quadruple. There's panic, disease, reports of people eating cats, bark, even grass. But here on the edge of the lake, the end of the world feels oddly poetic. Then, one night, Byron throws out a challenge. Each of us will write a ghost story. You'd expect this to be a harmless parlour game, the kind you abandon halfway through once the wine runs out. But not this group. This group is peak romanticism, with a side of repressed trauma and storm-induced cabin fever, and that's when Mary Shelley, just 18 years old, has a nightmare. A vision. A flicker of something strange. A young scientist, obsessed with cheating death. A corpse, animated by ambition and lightning. A creation unloved. Frankenstein is born, not in a dark lab, but in the long shadow of climate catastrophe. This wasn't just gothic drama, it was climate fiction, literally forged in a year when the sun vanished. Here's your historical fact. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, published in 1818, is widely considered one of the first works of science fiction, and it was directly inspired by the cold, wet, miserable summer of 1816. Her preface explicitly references the ungenial summer that kept her indoors. It's easy to forget that behind the literary legacy was a very real atmosphere of gloom and uncertainty. And here's your quirky fringe fact. Sunspots, or rather the lack of them, also get pulled into the conversation. The sun was oddly quiet in the years surrounding Tambura's eruption, with fewer sunspots than usual. Some scientists speculate that this solar lull may have amplified the global cooling. So in a roundabout way, Frankenstein might owe its existence not just to a volcano, but to a sleepy sun. You can't make this stuff up. Well, you can, but Mary did it first. There's still academic debate today over how much weather shaped that story. Some argue it's overblown, that Frankenstein is more about industrialization, identity, or morality. Fair. But when you trace the mood of that summer, the eerie skies, the leafless trees in July, the news from home about famines and floods, it's hard not to feel the chill behind every word. That creature, stitched together from dead things, is born into a cold and hostile world, rejected by its creator, feared by society. Sound familiar? Now imagine yourself there, huddled near a fire in the villa, listening to the others read drafts of their stories. Polidori is working on something too, a story about a vampire aristocrat, which eventually becomes the model for Dracula. The wind is howling through the shutters, the lamps flicker, you're eating salted fish and stale bread because the market ran out of vegetables weeks ago. But somehow, this gloom is productive. It breeds invention, or maybe madness, and outside the literary circle, things are decidedly less romantic. Across Europe, food riots continue. Churches hold prayer services for sunlight. In North America, the Northeast faces black frosts in August. Crops are dead. Livestock are dying. There's a real fear that something fundamental has changed, that maybe this isn't just a bad year, but a permanent shift. The sun, one farmer writes in his diary, seems to have forgotten us. And the scholars still can't quite agree. Was Tambura's eruption alone responsible for the dark summer of 1816? Or did it ride the coattails of the Little Ice Age, boosted by solar inactivity and a string of other eruptions across the globe? Tambora gets most of the press, but it wasn't the only volcano belching soot into the sky. There's even a fringe theory that a meteor strike may have contributed, because apparently Earth was going through something. You lean back now, modern and warm, under a thick duvet. Your room is silent except for the hum of your phone charging, the soft tick of the clock. Outside, maybe the wind rattles your window a little, but you know spring is coming. You've read Frankenstein in high school, probably skimmed through it, maybe wrote a last-minute essay on its themes. But now you understand it differently. Not just as a story about monsters, but as a story born from weather so severe it changed culture. The year without a summer didn't just freeze crops. It froze imaginations in place long enough to thaw into something new, strange, haunting, beautiful in the way only something forged in desperation can be. And that's the coldest truth of all. Sometimes the deepest winter doesn't kill the story. It creates it. You're marching through snow that rises past your knees, your breath coming out in short, ragged puffs that instantly freeze in the air. Your rifle weighs twice what it should, soaked and crusted with ice, and your fingers, well, you stopped feeling them about an hour ago. You don't know exactly where you are, just that it's northern Finland, it's 1939, and this is not how you thought a war would go. You're a Soviet soldier, and you're discovering firsthand that invading a country nicknamed the Land of 1,000 Lakes also means the land of 1,000 frozen ambushes. Welcome to the Winter War, where winter wasn't just a backdrop, it was the main character. Let's rewind a bit. It's late November, and the Soviet Union, fresh from dividing Poland with Nazi Germany, decides it's time to pressure Finland into ceding some territory for defensive purposes. The Finns, not thrilled about handing over their land to Stalin, refuse. So the USSR invades with over 400,000 troops, tanks, bombers, the works. They're expecting a quick and overwhelming victory. After all, Finland has a tiny army, barely any tanks, and a population that's smaller than the number of Soviet troops on the front lines. This should be easy, but it's not, because the Soviets forgot to check the weather, or geography, or Finnish history. The winter of 1939 to 1940 turns out to be one of the coldest in decades, with temperatures dropping below -40 degrees Celsius, -40 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas. And the Finns, they're built for it. White camouflage, skis, intimate knowledge of the forests, and a serious grudge. You're a Red Army soldier, and you start to realise something's off when your boots freeze to your own feet overnight. The canvas tents offer little protection. The food, when you get it, is frozen solid. You can't even light a cigarette without your lips sticking to the filter. The cold becomes a weapon, and the Finns are experts in using it. Here's your historical fact. Despite being outnumbered more than 3-1, Finland held off the Soviet invasion for over 3 months, inflicting massive casualties, around 126,000 Soviet troops killed or missing. The Finnish losses were heavy too, but proportionally the Soviets were getting wrecked. Part of that was strategy, part was terrain. But a huge part was just the cold. Finnish soldiers, wearing wool-lined coats and fur hats, moved through the forests on skis like ghosts. They'd appear, attack, and vanish into the trees before the Soviets could even react. Meanwhile, Soviet tanks froze, literally froze, engines wouldn't start, metal cracked, fuel turned to slush. Their troops, packed into poorly insulated transport vehicles and unfamiliar with extreme conditions, began dropping not from gunfire but from frostbite. And then there's the quirky fact, which somehow makes it all even more surreal. The Finns created homemade explosives out of alcohol, tar and potassium chlorate, tossing them like fiery snowballs into Soviet tanks. You know the name, Molotov cocktails. Yep, those came from here. The term was actually a dark joke, named after Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, who claimed the USSR was dropping food supplies, not bombs. The Finns responded by calling Soviet bombs Molotov bread baskets, and their explosive response the cocktail to go with it. But the most brutal aspect wasn't bombs, it was still the cold. Soviet soldiers froze in trenches, fingers blackened and snapped, eyelashes turned white. There are stories of entire units huddling together, only to be found days later. Frozen solid in a grotesque embrace of survival instinct and failure. Supply lines couldn't keep up. Fuel depots iced over. Soldiers literally burned their own ammunition crates just to stay alive. Scholars continue to debate just how decisive the winter was compared to Finnish strategy. Some argue the Soviets would have fumbled the invasion even in mild weather, due to poor leadership and outdated tactics. Others insist the cold turned a likely Soviet victory into a humiliating slog. The truth, as usual, is a frosty mixture of both. What's certain is that weather humbled an empire. By March 1940, the Winter War officially ended with the Moscow Peace Treaty. Finland ceded some territory, but retained its independence, a rare outcome when the Soviet Union came knocking. Stalin was embarrassed. His army had taken a beating both from bullets and blizzards. The Finns, meanwhile, emerged with their pride intact and their reputation for resilience carved into ice. And what about you? You're back in the present, lying under a mountain of blankets, listening to the hum of the heater and the distant hush of wind against your window. You try to imagine what it felt like to trudge through a frozen forest in silence, rifle slung across your back, knowing every breath you took might be your last, not from a bullet, but from the cold itself. The Winter War isn't one of the headline-grabbing conflicts. It's overshadowed by the larger nightmares of World War II. But in those woods, under those grey skies, men fought and died because winter demanded it. The Finns weren't fighting just Stalin. They were fighting snow, frost, hunger and despair. And they won, not with numbers, but with endurance. Because sometimes, war isn't just man versus man. Sometimes, it's man versus the planet. And in 1939, Finland proved that knowing how to ski and survive a whiteout mattered just as much, if not more, than having tanks and planes. The Earth picked a side that winter, and it wasn't the one with more soldiers. You're standing on cracked, barren earth, the colour of bone-dry toast, staring at a field that used to grow wheat, or corn, or maybe it was meant to grow anything but dust. The wind picks up, and with it comes another black blizzard, a storm made not of rain but of soil itself. You pull a bandana over your mouth and squint into the swirling darkness. It's Oklahoma, sometime in the 1930s. And while most people remember the Dust Bowl for its choking drought and endless dirt, fewer talk about what came after. Because when the dust settled, it froze. That's right. As if 10 years of erosion, crop failure and economic collapse weren't enough, nature decided to toss in a few brutal winters, just for flavour. And so, tonight, we visit one of the most overlooked chapters in the slow-moving apocalypse of the Dust Bowl, its hidden deep freezes, where temperatures plummeted across the Great Plains and Midwest, turning desperation into something icier, meaner, and even harder to survive. And imagine this. It's December 1935. Your crops are already gone. The bank took your tractor. Your roof leaks dust when it should leak rain. But now there's ice on your windows, thick enough to etch your name in with a fingernail. Snow blankets the bare, eroded land, and it doesn't even look real. It's like someone layered powdered sugar over a graveyard. The wheat fields are dead. The topsoil, long since blown into someone else's county, and now you have to deal with frostbite on top of everything else. Historical fact, during the winter of 1935 to 1936, temperatures across parts of the US dropped to historic lows. The Great Plains recorded weeks of sub-zero weather. In North Dakota, it hit minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 51 degrees Celsius. People froze to death just trying to walk to the barn. Trains stopped running. Snowdrifts piled higher than windows. Schools closed for months if they hadn't already shut down due to dust and poverty. In Nebraska and Kansas, families burned anything they could find. Broken fences, dried cow patties, even furniture to keep warm. The Dust Bowl winters weren't just cold, they were cruel. The dryness from years of drought meant little moisture in the air, so when the cold came it cut straight through everything. There was no humidity to soften the blow. The cold was sharp, surgical. It seeped into walls, into lungs, into bones, and because people were already struggling to survive in the best of conditions, this just pushed them closer to the edge. Here's the quirky part. The very dust that had ruined the land sometimes insulated homes, weirdly enough. Some families reported that dust piling up outside actually kept their sod houses a little warmer, acting like an ugly, filthy blanket. Of course, it also got into their food, lungs and teeth, so not a great trade-off. Still, in a twisted way, the dust gave and took. You had to respect it, even as you choked on it. You picture yourself in a tiny farmhouse now, no insulation, no central heating, just a cast-iron stove and a pile of wood that looks far too small for what's coming. The snow outside has crusted over, the top layer shimmering in moonlight. Your kids are asleep, bundled in coats and feed sacks stitched into makeshift blankets. You're wearing every piece of clothing you own, but your fingers still sting. The fire crackles, low and sullen. You don't know how many more nights you can stretch this out. And the cows, dead or dying. Water troughs frozen solid. Your wife chipped a tooth trying to break the ice. You can't afford coal. You can't afford anything. The price of grain is still in the gutter, and the government's promising relief. but it feels like empty words spoken through frozen telephone lines. And when you finally step outside in the morning, the sky is clear, but the snow glows with a faint tint of red-brown dust, like the land itself is still bleeding. Scholars don't talk much about the cold of the Dust Bowl years. The drought steals the spotlight. But weather records don't lie. The winters of the mid-1930s were some of the worst on record, particularly in the Midwest. Meteorologists still study that period, scratching their heads over the wild temperature swings, the way blizzards followed dust storms like aftershocks. One theory suggests the massive soil erosion and heat absorption during summer may have triggered more violent winter systems. Another suggests it was just bad timing, a natural cycle of Arctic fronts meeting an already weakened landscape. And that's the scary part. No one fully agrees on how it all fit together. Drought, dust, and freeze, all dancing in a grim waltz of climatic misfortune. There's even some speculation that volcanic activity from the early 1930s might have nudged global temperatures just enough to throw North American weather out of rhythm. Maybe, or maybe it was just the planet reminding everyone who's in charge. You return now to your warm bed, letting the images of frozen prairie towns melt away. But it lingers, doesn't it? The thought of huddling beneath patched quilts while a blizzard slaps against the door, knowing there's no food in the pantry, no money in the bank, and no crops in the ground. Just another morning, waiting for the sun to rise and hoping this time it brings warmth instead of wind. The Dust Bowl wasn't just about dryness. It was about extremes. Too dry, too cold, too cruel. And through it all, people didn't give up. They froze, they cracked, they broke, but many kept going. Because even when nature folds its arms and refuses to cooperate, sometimes the only thing left is stubbornness. And a good solid stove. You're not wearing the right shoes for this. That's the first thing you notice as you step onto a slushy cobblestone street. Your soul's immediately soaking through. Because you're in Naples, of all places, a city known for its pizza, its sunshine, its wild scooters and laundry-draped balconies. Not, historically, for snow, but on this rare and unsettling morning in the heart of southern Italy, it's white outside. Not fog, not ash. Snow. Thick, cold, unwelcome. And the locals are staring up at the sky like it's raining frogs. It's the winter of 1709, and yes, the same one that crushed France in a glacier-fueled economic spiral. But here, way down in the Mediterranean, something even stranger is happening. Because this region almost never sees snow. It's like waking up in Miami to find your pool frozen and a snowman in the shallow end. It doesn't compute. And yet, here it is. Naples, powdered like a Christmas card but without any of the joy. The orange trees are drooping, their fruit frozen mid-ripening. The stone steps leading up to the churches are slick with ice. The Vesuvius-silhouetted skyline is glazed in frost, and the people, confused, cold, and more than a little superstitious. Here's your historical fact. This wasn't just a one-time fluke. Naples recorded multiple snowfalls over the 17th and 18th centuries, often coinciding with particularly harsh winters in northern Europe. But 1709 stands out because it wasn't just a sprinkle. It was a full-blown freeze, part of the larger Great Frost event we've already visited. This wasn't winter getting playful. It was winter invading. Locals at the time wrote about the cold like it was a punishment from God. Churches filled with people praying for warmth, for spring, for forgiveness. Because what else explained snow in Naples? The city's fountains froze solid. The fish markets had to shut down, not because of ice on the roads, but because the sea itself began to freeze along the shoreline. You imagine standing on the edge of the Bay of Naples and seeing slush lapping at the dock. Salt water, frozen. That's not normal. That's ominous. And here's a quirky bit of fringe history. Some astrologers of the time blamed a planetary alignment for the snow. Jupiter, Saturn and Mars had been stacking up in the sky, and the more esoteric thinkers were convinced that when the planets get too cozy, the Earth gets nervous. So nervous it freezes. Others, more grounded but still creative, thought it was volcanic steam from Vesuvius reacting with sea air and creating a localized snowstorm. An imaginative stretch, sure, but people were grasping for anything that made the ice make sense. Now let's back up a few years. The mid to late 1600s saw strange winters across the Mediterranean. In Rome, the Tiber River froze over. People skated under the ancient bridges. In Sicily, frost killed off olive trees that had been growing for generations. Even parts of North Africa saw snowfall. This wasn't just a one-city phenomenon, it was a southern chill that reached places thought to be impervious to winter's worst. Climatologists now think these odd cold snaps were part of the Little Ice Age, amplified by volcanic activity like the eruption of Mount Etna in 1669, a big one that likely disturbed regional weather patterns. Ash clouds, solar dimming, jet stream weirdness, it all adds up. Sort of. But there's still debate. Mediterranean snowfall is so rare that many ancient accounts are written in wide-eyed disbelief, which makes them both fascinating and frustrating for modern historians. Was it really snow, or hail, or frost mistaken for flurries? But in 1709 there's no doubt. Naples is frozen, and the consequences ripple outward. Citrus crops are lost, vineyards suffer, grain imports slow because shipping becomes dangerous, and the poorest suffer the most, as always. You walk past a family huddled outside a shuttered bakery. The father's beard is rimmed with ice. The mother wraps her shawl around a baby so tightly it looks like a bundle of rags. They're waiting for the church bells to ring. Sometimes that means soup. Sometimes it just means another funeral. And what about you? You're staying in a villa on the hillside. Normally you'd have a view of the sparkling bay, the islands dotting the horizon. But today, all you see is fog and frost. You try to warm your hands by a tiny fireplace that's barely lit because the wood's too damp to burn properly. The stone walls are sweating cold, and even wrapped in blankets you're shivering. In the city someone builds a snowman, clumsily, joylessly. People gather around, not to admire it, but to cross themselves. It's unnatural, they whisper. The kids aren't laughing, they're hungry, they're scared. The novelty of snow wears off fast when there's no firewood and the pasta's frozen in its pot. By the end of the month the snow melts, the streets flood. Cold gives way to wet. Disease follows. The runoff carries sewage into drinking water. The hospitals fill, and like that, Naples goes from freezing to rotting, all within a few brutal weeks. Modern scholars look back on this and scratch their heads. How did Naples, a city not known for wool coats and sleds, handle these mini ice ages? The answer is not well. There's very little infrastructure for extreme cold in warm weather cities even today. Back then, it was chaos, and not the good kind. Just suffering, poorly documented, swept under the rug of southern sunshine once the thaw came. You lie in bed now, heater humming, not a single snowflake in sight. But the idea of Naples under snow lingers, doesn't it? That quiet dissonance. Palm trees frosted like pastries, fishermen slipping on icy piers, saints in stained glass staring down at frozen pews, a city out of place in its own climate, blinking in confusion at the sky. Because sometimes history isn't about big battles or famous names. Sometimes it's about the day winter took a vacation south and ruined everything. You're climbing a staircase so steep and snow-covered it might as well be carved into the side of a glacier. Your breath comes in short bursts, fogging the air around your scarf-wrapped face. Below you is a winding mountain road. Above you, the roof of a small wooden inn clings to the side of the cliff like it's afraid of falling off. Welcome to Snow Country. Not just a poetic nickname, but a brutally literal one. You're in Japan in the early 1800s, walking through the thick, unforgiving winters of Echigo Province, one of the snowiest inhabited regions on Earth. This place is no stranger to snow, not just a few inches here and there, meters, as in 10, sometimes 12 of them. That's 30 feet of snow or more, layered thick on rooftops until the houses resemble giant sleeping animals buried beneath white fur. People carve tunnels between buildings. They build second-story doors, not for architectural flair, but because the first floor is often completely snowed in. Snow is a way of life, a way of survival, and sometimes a way of surrender. Here's your historical fact. Some regions in Japan, particularly Onuma and Aomori, receive over 500 inches, 1,270 centimetres, of snow per year. That's more than almost anywhere else on the planet where people actually live, and they've been doing it for centuries. Villages have adapted through snow sheds, shared granaries, multi-generational homes, and an uncanny knack for making peace with the cold. You imagine stepping inside one of those homes now, your boots soaked, your shoulders aching from carrying water and firewood. Inside, it's warm, dim, and filled with the smell of rice cooking over a sunken hearth, the aurori. The ceiling is stained black from decades of smoke. An old woman sits cross-legged weaving straw sandals by candlelight. You sip hot sake, the warmth spreading out from your belly, and for a moment the snow feels far away. But it never is. It waits just outside, falling in absolute silence. Thick flakes, steady as breath, piling up on roofs, on trees, on the memory of everything. Some years it gets so deep that families must spend half their winter simply digging out. You shovel your roof, your neighbour's roof, the school's roof, and if you don't, the snow will crush it, literally. There are records of homes collapsing under their own white weight. Here's your quirky fringe fact. In the Edo period, certain rural snow-covered villages developed snow-watching platforms, almost like scenic balconies, from which wealthier residents could gaze at the snowfall for entertainment. Yes, while most people were out breaking their backs with shovels, some folks were aesthetically appreciating the blizzard. It was seen as spiritually cleansing, a kind of natural performance art. Nothing like a little class division to season your snowstorm. And yet, life in snow country wasn't always bleak. It was also beautiful, communal, deeply tied to rhythm and ritual. The snow-insulated homes, muffled sound created a cocoon where families gathered around the fire and passed long months through storytelling, craft making and food preservation. This is the season of pickled vegetables, fermented bean paste, dried persimmons and thick mochi cakes. You prepare for winter all year, and then, when it arrives, you give yourself over to it, because fighting it would be like fighting the tide. But of course, things don't always go smoothly. Avalanches are a constant threat. In some regions, entire villages have been relocated after being repeatedly buried. Travel becomes nearly impossible. Children walk to school with yuki-geta, snowshoes made of bamboo and cloaks layered in oil paper to repel the wet. It's charming in the abstract, until you realise that some of these kids are hiking miles through snowstorms just to learn their multiplication tables. There's scholarly debate about how snow country shaped Japanese culture as a whole. Some argue that the stoicism, community cohesion, and minimalism often associated with traditional Japanese values come directly from these long winters. Others think that's reading too much into it, that yes, the snow forced adaptation, but it didn't define the entire national character. Still, it's hard to ignore the influence when so much regional literature, especially from authors like Yasunari Kawabata, centres on the snow's psychological weight. Kawabata even titled his Nobel Prize-winning novel Snow Country, a haunting story set in these icy mountain towns, where the landscape is both breathtaking and suffocating. The snow is a metaphor, of course, for isolation, memory, longing, but it's also just there, relentlessly falling, like time itself. You go outside now, back into the storm. The snow is up to your thighs, and it's still falling. The cold isn't brutal. It's quiet, persistent, inevitable. You stop and look around. Everything is white. The mountains rise around you like frozen waves, and you can hear the soft rumble of snow sliding somewhere in the distance. Not an avalanche. Not yet. Just gravity doing what gravity does. And here's the most startling part. Despite centuries of hardship, people still live here. They still farm rice in the summer, they still raise families, they still shovel and dry persimmons and watch the snow fall from their second-story porches. They've turned survival into ceremony. The snow comes, and they bow their heads and wait. Not out of defeat, but out of respect. Back in your warm bed, the hum of a heater in your ears, you think about what it takes to live a life in a place where half the year is winter, where getting to school is an expedition, and a shovel is as important as a spoon. You think about how snow, in the right amounts, is beautiful, but when it overstays its welcome, it becomes something else, something heavier, something to build your life around. Not everyone can live in snow country, but for those who do, every winter is a quiet victory. You're standing at the edge of what should be a vast, unforgiving sea, but instead it looks like a pale, rippled field. The Baltic Sea in front of you is frozen over, not just crusted with ice, not a delicate film you might cautiously tiptoe across, but solid, thick, and eerie in its quiet stillness. It's the middle of winter in Sweden, probably the 17th century, and the horizon is one long frigid sheet of possibility. You can't see where the sea ends and the sky begins, just a white blur. And the really strange part, there's a military convoy marching across it. Yes, armies crossing a frozen sea. You're not hallucinating. You're witnessing one of the most bizarre and dangerous logistical feats in military history. When winter didn't stop war, It enabled it. The year is 1658, and Sweden is locked in a brutal conflict with Denmark. King Charles X, Gustav of Sweden, is ambitious, aggressive, and just barely crazy enough to think the weather is on his side. After a string of victories and a hunger for more land, he gets word from his scouts. The sea ice is thick, thicker than anyone expected, and not just near the coast. The Danish archipelago, usually protected by the salty waters of the Little Belt and Great Belt Straits, is frozen solid. Suddenly, Denmark is no longer surrounded by water. It's exposed. And Charles sees his moment. Here's your historical fact. During the Second Northern War, in February 1658, the Swedish army conducted the now legendary march across the belts, crossing the frozen sea straits from Jutland to the Danish islands. More than 9,000 soldiers, plus cavalry, cannons and supply wagons, moved across the ice-covered Baltic, an act so risky it sounds like folklore. But it happened, and it worked. You imagine being one of those soldiers. You're wearing layers of wool, leather, and what's left of your courage. You're walking across what your instincts tell you is wrong. People don't walk on oceans. But there's a commander ahead shouting encouragement, and 1,000 boots behind you making retreat impossible. Every creak of ice beneath your feet sounds like doom, and yet, it holds. Somehow. The march takes days. Wind whips across the flatness, offering no cover, no sound except your own breathing and the soft crunch of ice underfoot. Horses whinny nervously. The cannons are dragged on sleds. You pass men who've slipped and broken limbs, others frostbitten and silent. But you keep moving, because if the ice gives way now, none of it matters. Charles's gamble pays off. His troops reach the island of Zealand unopposed. The Danes, blindsided and completely unprepared for an attack from the ice, are forced into a treaty. The result? The Treaty of Roskilde, where Denmark cedes massive territory to Sweden, Scania, Blekinge, Halland and more. Sweden becomes briefly a dominant power in northern Europe, and it was made possible not by superior tactics or technology, but by a very, very cold winter. Now here's your quirky fringe fact. During the same period, parts of the Baltic were so frozen that mail routes were established over the sea, with sleds and even pop-up taverns set up on the ice. Temporary inns built on frozen water, serving hot drinks to travellers crossing from one country to another. Imagine sipping warm mead while sitting on a wooden stool above 20 feet of icy death. People didn't just fear the ice, they used it. This wasn't a one-time fluke either. The Baltic Sea froze over in other winters as well, especially during the Little Ice Age, when sea ice pushed further south than usual. In 1426, and again in the 18th century, people crossed from Germany to Denmark on foot. Ferries. Optional. Just wait for January and bring a sled. Scholars still argue over the exact thickness of the ice during Charles's march. Was it uniformly thick, or were parts barely passable? Did the army spread out to reduce weight or take risks over thin patches? Some believe Charles got lucky. Others think he had ice scouts mapping it days ahead. The truth is likely a blend of bravado and desperation. Sweden was stretched thin. Charles needed a miracle. Winter gave him one. But it wasn't without cost. Not all soldiers survived the cold. Frostbite claimed fingers, ears, feet. Some supply wagons were lost, and if the ice had cracked at the wrong moment, if a thaw had come a day earlier, Charles's entire army could have vanished into the sea. His legacy would have been a footnote about poor timing instead of a chapter about iceborne conquest. You stand now at the edge of the same sea, imagining it frozen once more. Today, with warming temperatures and rising salinity, the Baltic doesn't freeze the way it used to. The odds of repeating a march across the belts today? Practically zero. Modern navies don't wait for winter, they send drones. But something about those soldiers, walking across a sea with muskets and cannonballs, feels more terrifying, more human. Back in your warm room, you listen to the gentle churn of a dishwasher or the hum of a distant train. No creaking ice beneath your feet, no howling winds sweeping across a frozen ocean, just comfort, predictability, the idea that seas stay liquid and armies stay on land. But for a brief, surreal moment in the 17th century, winter said otherwise, and one king listened. The silence is unbearable, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that hums with tension, the kind where each breath feels like it echoes too loudly. You're inside a frozen city, windows taped, doors barricaded, the air brittle with fear. Outside it's snowing softly, deceptively gentle, But this isn't a peaceful winter. This is Leningrad, 1941. The Nazis have surrounded the city. No one's getting in. No one's getting out. And the cold? The cold is your constant companion gnawing at your skin, your stomach, your soul. This is the siege of Leningrad, one of the most brutal and harrowing chapters of World War II. For 872 days, from September 1941 to January 1944, the city was encircled by German and Finnish forces, cut off from supplies and subjected to relentless shelling and starvation. But what made the siege truly unforgettable was the winter, more than one in fact, during which nature joined the assault with deadly precision. Let's talk about the first real winter, 1941 to 1942. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Heating systems failed, pipes froze, buildings cracked from the cold. Food was already scarce, but now even boiling water was a challenge. You imagine lighting a fire with torn-up floorboards because there's nothing else to burn. You pull your coat tighter and realise it's not a coat. It's a blanket you've cut armholes into. Historical fact, by the end of that first winter, over 600,000 people, mostly civilians, had died in Leningrad. That's more than the total deaths from the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Most didn't die from bombs or bullets. They died from hunger and cold. Starvation was everywhere. People boiled wallpaper for the glue, ate sawdust bread. There are documented cases of cannibalism, whispered about then, confirmed later. But most people didn't resort to that. They simply wasted away. And then came the snow. The snow blanketed the horror in white silence. Corpses froze on benches, in stairwells, on the sides of the roads. Too many to bury. People stepped over them, numb to it. What else could they do? The ground was too frozen to dig, the bodies too frozen to move. You walk the icy streets now. Your boots have holes. You pass a woman carrying a bundle that looks far too light to be wrapped in so many layers. A child trails behind, dragging a sled that's not for playing. It's for transporting water, or maybe something darker. The only sound is the wind, the occasional crack of ice, maybe an explosion in the distance. And yet, somehow, the city didn't fall. Here's your quirky historical detail. Despite the unimaginable conditions, Leningrad continued producing art and music. In 1942, composer Dmitri Shostakovich, himself trapped in the city before being evacuated, wrote the Seventh Symphony, Leningrad. It was performed in the besieged city by an orchestra of starving musicians, some of whom were pulled off the front lines and given extra rations just so they could play. The concert was broadcast over loudspeakers, not just within Leningrad but toward the German lines. Imagine that. Starving people, wrapped in rags, sitting in a freezing concert hall listening to a symphony while bombs fell in the distance. It wasn't just music, it was defiance. It was the city saying, "We are still here, we are still human." The scholarly debate surrounding Leningrad's winters centres on this brutal duality. How did a city survive conditions that should have been unsurvivable? Was it Stalin's iron will? The people's resilience? The cold's equal cruelty to both sides? The truth is likely all of it. What's certain is that winter shaped the entire experience of the siege. Without it, perhaps the Germans would have taken the city, or perhaps the people inside would have broken sooner. But winter levelled the battlefield and raised the cost. The Soviet response to the cold was both desperate and resourceful. Families sealed windows with anything they could find: cloth, newspaper, even clothing. Entire apartment blocks became communal living spaces to share heat. People learned to cook anything remotely edible: fermented cabbage, sawdust crackers, boiled shoe leather. You chewed slowly, savouring calories like treasure. The Road of Life, a makeshift ice road across frozen Lake Ladoga, became the city's only lifeline. Trucks carried in food and supplies, skidding across miles of thin, cracking ice, while German bombers circled above. On the way back, they carried out the sick, the dying, and the hopeful. Many of them never made it. You stand on the edge of Lake Ladoga now, staring at what looks like just another sheet of frozen water. But you know better. Beneath this ice are stories, thousands of them, of heroism, tragedy, and sheer endurance. You feel the weight of it, the sheer emotional gravity of a city that froze but never surrendered. And then the thaw came, slowly, like everything else. The siege lifted in January 1944, and the people who remained, emaciated, frostbitten but unbowed, began to rebuild. Buildings were patched, railways reconnected, bodies were buried finally, but the scars, both physical and psychological, never fully healed. Back in your bed, you shift beneath your blankets, your stomach full, your fingers warm. You think of the woman in the stairwell, the boy with the sled, the orchestra playing into the cold. You think of silence that wasn't peaceful but hollow, and the snow, always the snow, covering everything not to hide it, but to preserve it. Because Leningrad didn't just survive a siege, it survived a winter that tried to erase it, and failed. You're walking through a quiet neighborhood that doesn't feel quite real. Trees lean under the weight of something heavier than snow, something shinier, stranger. Every twig, every blade of grass, every power line and rooftop is encased in a shell of ice. Thick, glassy, glistening under a sky the colour of pewter. This isn't a fairy tale winter wonderland. It's Canada. It's January 1998, and you're in the middle of one of the worst ice storms in modern history. At first glance, it's beautiful. Absurdly so. Everything is shimmering, frozen in time. You snap a photo, maybe two, before the cold starts biting at your fingertips, and then you hear it. Crack. A soft pop, then a slow creaking groan like a massive ship breaking apart, and suddenly a tree collapses, dragging a tangle of frozen power lines with it. Sparks fly. Somewhere the lights go out. For good. This was the North American ice storm of 1998, and it hit eastern Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and parts of the northeastern US, with a level of devastation usually reserved for hurricanes or wars. Unlike a blizzard, which is loud and obvious, an ice storm sneaks up. It begins with freezing rain, a drizzle that coats every surface and then locks it into a crystalline prison. For 5 straight days, that rain fell, and the world turned to glass. Here's your historical fact. The 1998 ice storm affected over 5 million people, caused $5.4 billion in damages, and resulted in 35 direct deaths, with dozens more indirectly due to exposure, fires, or carbon monoxide poisoning from improvised heating. Over 1,000 transmission towers collapsed under the weight of ice, some of them massive steel structures, bent like twist ties. At its peak, 3 million people were without power, some for over a month. You walk into a grocery store lit by candles and flashlights. The shelves are half empty. The generator hums like a dying animal in the background. People are lined up with armfuls of batteries, canned soup, firewood, if they're lucky. You grab what you can. You don't even like Spam, but you take it anyway. And the cold? The cold is immediate and omnipresent. Homes lose heat quickly. Pipes burst. Basements flood. People huddle under blankets in living rooms, lighting candles, burning furniture, breathing into cupped hands. You visit neighbours, elderly relatives, anyone who might be vulnerable. Some have fireplaces. Most don't. The lucky ones have gas stoves or generators. The rest just wait. Here's your quirky fringe fact. In some parts of rural Quebec, residents began sleeping in their cars, running them for heat, and taking shifts through the night to prevent carbon monoxide buildup. Others lived in shopping malls, community centres, even hockey arenas turned into emergency shelters. Imagine being wrapped in a coat, eating stale cookies, trying to sleep under fluorescent lights while the world outside freezes in slow motion. But this wasn't just a local event. The scale of the damage was national. The Canadian military deployed 16,000 troops, the largest peacetime deployment in the country's history, to clear debris, deliver supplies, and assist with evacuations. Roads became treacherous or impassable. Crews worked around the clock to restore power, only to watch fresh ice undo everything they'd just repaired. It was Sisyphean, and it went on for weeks. The emotional toll was just as heavy. People lost homes, businesses shuttered, farms collapsed. Dairy farmers, unable to milk cows or refrigerate milk, watched entire herds suffer. Some had to dump gallons of spoiled milk into ditches while the cows shivered in frozen barns. The sound of chainsaws became as common as birdsong, cutting fallen trees, clearing driveways, slicing through the wreckage of a frozen world. Climatologists still analyse the event with a mix of awe and dread. How could it have happened so quickly? How did one slow-moving system unleash such a vast and prolonged disaster? The culprit was a rare alignment of warm air above cold air near the surface, creating perfect freezing rain conditions, and then that pattern just stalled, dumping moisture over the same regions for nearly 120 hours. It was like someone had hit pause on the atmosphere while slowly twisting the cold knob. Debate continues about how climate change may or may not affect future ice storms. Some argue that warming trends will reduce their frequency. Others suggest they'll become more intense, as volatile weather patterns create the perfect chaos cocktail. Either way, what happened in '98 is still considered the benchmark, the nightmare scenario emergency planners quietly dread. And what about the human response? In the aftermath, people didn't riot. They didn't loot. They checked on their neighbours. They shared firewood. Schools closed, but kids stayed active, helping shovel snow and carry supplies. Strangers became friends. Families rediscovered board games. There's even a story of a couple who had planned to divorce, but after a week in the same freezing house with no power, no internet, and no distractions, they reconciled. Ice therapy, apparently. You walk back through the streets past drifts of broken branches and twisted metal. The world is quiet, stunned. Above you, the sun finally peeks through the clouds, glinting off the ice like everything's been dipped in diamonds. It's gorgeous and terrifying. Back in your room, warm and electrically lit, you glance at your phone, your heater, your flickering screen. You can almost hear the distant creak of branches, the pop of transformers failing one by one. You wonder how long you'd last without it all. A few days? A week? Because when winter doesn't scream, when it doesn't show up with a blizzard or a frost wave or a roaring wind, but instead whispers and coats the world in ice, it's not any less dangerous. In fact, it might be worse. It waits, it weighs, and then it brings everything crashing down. Quietly. You're squinting into a grey sky, the kind of sky that looks like it wants to say something, but can't quite get the words out. A cold wind scrapes across the village, not howling, just whispering. The fields are bare, the animals skittish, and no one slept well in weeks. It's the early 1600s, somewhere in Central Europe. Maybe Würzburg or Bamberg, maybe some smaller town too unimportant to make the maps, and people are starting to act strange. Crops have failed again. The winter came early and it won't let go. And in the bitter quiet of snow-covered fields and unheated churches, a chilling thought begins to spread. Someone must be to blame. Welcome to one of the most insidious side effects of a freezing world, the witch hunts. You think witch hunts were all torches and pitchforks, angry mobs chasing old women into the woods, right? That's part of it. But the truth is, it was far colder and far more calculated. During the peak decades of the Little Ice Age, Europe experienced a bizarre and terrifying uptick in witch trials, particularly during the late 1500s and 1600s. And while there were many social and political reasons for this, there's one factor that historians keep circling back to: the weather. Here's your historical fact. Some of the largest and deadliest witch hunts in European history occurred during unusually cold decades. Between 1580 and 1650, thousands of people, mostly women, mostly poor, were accused, tortured, and executed for allegedly causing bad weather. That's right. Frost, hail, blizzards, and failed harvests were all evidence, apparently, of witchcraft. You step inside a cold stone church where the town magistrates are holding a hearing. A girl of 15 stands accused of summoning a frost demon that ruined the barley crop. The evidence? Her neighbour saw her collecting herbs at dusk. She owns a cat. She spoke harshly to a pig that died the next day. And worst of all, she didn't attend Mass last Sunday. You know how this ends. In 1626, Bamberg, in what is now southern Germany, hosted one of the most notorious witch trials in history. Over 900 people were executed in a frenzy that lasted nearly a decade. Entire families were implicated. Property was seized. Confessions were extracted under torture. So much torture that some suspects confessed to riding weather demons through the sky, or milking phantom cows that gave poison cream. The absurdity was grotesque, but it was also desperate. People were starving, livestock were dying, winters were long, and when you're freezing and your children are coughing blood into straw beds, you're willing to believe anything that gives you a reason for the suffering. Quirky fringe fact. A pamphlet printed in 1563 by a German theologian claimed that witches had gathered in Alpine meadows to conjure snowstorms that would bury Protestant villages. Another account described witches flying over the Swiss Alps in midwinter, using frost-laced whips to steer cloud dragons into enemy farmland. Fantasy, of course, But when your village has lost its grain for 3 years in a row, and the river is frozen solid in April, fantasy starts to look like logic. The scholarly debate here is both fascinating and unsettling. Did climate instability cause witch hunts? Or did it simply provide the ideal conditions for mass hysteria to thrive? Most agree on this much. When societies are stressed, especially by invisible forces like climate, scapegoats become inevitable. And who better to blame than the old woman who knows how to make herbal tea or the widow who talks to her chickens? You walk down a snow-covered road now, past the gallows, past the silent townspeople who avert their eyes. The accused woman from earlier? Gone. No one speaks of her anymore. A new snow has fallen, covering the footprints to the prison, to the stake, to the ashes. You ask a farmer how the crops look this year, and he just shrugs, stares at the sky like he's waiting for it to judge him. These weren't isolated events. The Scottish witch hunts, the Basque trials, the Salem hysteria, all happened during periods of colder than average weather. There's even a timeline comparison floating around academic circles that shows a correlation between temperature dips and spikes in witch executions. Correlation isn't causation, but it's hard to ignore. And then there's the way cold creeps into the mind. Long winters mean long nights, fewer distractions, tighter quarters, add hunger, illness and despair, and people begin to see things. Shadows where there are none, whispers in the trees, a goat that looks at you the wrong way. The line between superstition and survival gets blurry real fast when it's snowing in May. Eventually the weather warms, slowly. The witch hunts taper off, thanks in part to Enlightenment thinking and yes, better crops. But the damage is done. Tens of thousands dead, their only crime being in the wrong place at the wrong temperature. And you wonder, how many of those trials were really about belief? And how many were just about fear? You crawl into your bed now, blankets heavy and warm, a cup of tea cooling on the nightstand. The idea of blaming someone for the weather seems absurd, but deep down, you know how fragile our sense of order is, how quickly humans reach for someone to punish when nature turns cruel. The cold doesn't care about fairness, it doesn't need a reason. But people do. And in the icy grip of the Little Ice Age, reason took a long winter nap. The wind comes in low and heavy, carrying with it not just a chill, but the kind of stillness that feels unnatural, like the earth itself is holding its breath. You're in northern Britain, somewhere near Hadrian's Wall in the 3rd century. The sky is a colourless smear. The Roman outpost you're standing in creaks under the weight of another unexpected frost. The grain stores are lower than they should be. The locals are restless, and the empire, once sprawling, golden, eternal, is beginning to feel a bit drafty. Welcome to the slow, frozen unravelling of Rome in the West. Now don't worry, we're not blaming the fall of Rome entirely on the weather. Rome had a long list of problems. Political infighting, overexpansion, military overreach, a currency system held together with chewing gum and optimism. But one factor that's been lurking more and more in the academic background is climate instability, and the possibility that a series of brutal winters and cold snaps helped chip away at one of the most powerful empires in history. Here's your historical fact. Tree ring data, ice cores, and sediment records suggest that parts of Europe experienced a sharp dip in temperatures during the late Roman period, particularly from the mid-200s through the 500 CE. This period is sometimes called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, and while the name might be a bit of a mouthful, its impact wasn't subtle. Shorter growing seasons, unseasonal frost, and weird shifts in rainfall patterns wreaked havoc on Roman agriculture. You imagine a Roman farmer near the Danube staring at his fields, still muddy in June, watching wheat fail to ripen on time. The calendar says it's harvest season, but the crops disagree. The granaries are low, the local magistrate is nervous, the soldiers haven't been paid, and the Germanic tribes to the north are watching, always watching. And speaking of tribes, let's talk about the migration period. Between the 4th and 6th centuries, Europe saw a massive wave of movements by groups like the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals and Huns. Were they all just looking for conquest and land? Sure, but they were also chasing better weather. Some historians argue that colder winters and failed harvests in Central Asia and Northern Europe pushed populations southward, right into Roman territory. A domino of frozen valleys and empty stomachs that led eventually to the sack of Rome itself. Quirky fringe fact. Some accounts claim that when Alaric and the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 CE, They were actually better fed and more organised than the starving Roman population they conquered. Rome hadn't just lost its edge, it had lost its climate advantage. The warming period that helped build the empire, what we now call the Roman climate optimum, was long over. And winter, like an unwelcome tenant, had moved in without asking. Back on the frontier, you're huddled in a Roman outpost that's half stone, half desperation. You wrap a wool cloak around your shoulders and try to forget that the legion that used to protect this region has been reassigned, or disbanded entirely. The Picts are growing bolder. Bandits stalk the old roads, and the roads themselves, cracked, overgrown, slowly being reclaimed by weeds and snow. In Rome, meanwhile, the politics are melting down faster than the spring thaw. Emperors come and go, some assassinated, some exiled, some just vanishing. Famine hits different regions every few years. Civil war becomes a seasonal event. The rich flee to their country villas, and the poor are left to freeze in crumbling tenements, hoping the next winter isn't worse than the last. Here's where the scholarly debate gets spicy. Some historians still downplay climate's role in Rome's decline, arguing that social, military and economic factors were far more significant. Fair enough. But others point to the increased frequency of droughts, floods, and cold waves as stress multipliers, forces that didn't cause collapse outright but accelerated it. Think of them as the final straw, layered in frost. There's even archaeological evidence that supports this. Layers of frozen grain residue in certain storage pits, shifts in animal husbandry, cattle being replaced by smaller, hardier livestock, a sudden rise in burial pits in some areas during known cold periods. It's not just theory, it's physical. You wander now through a ruined villa on the edge of the former empire. Snow drifts in through broken columns. Mosaics, once vibrant, are faded and cracked. You can still see the outlines of Roman grandeur, but it's all been dulled by time, ice and neglect. A frozen silence rests over everything, broken only by the wind. It's not dramatic. It's slow, like frost creeping into the corners of a once glorious painting. And then, somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls. A church, maybe. Because as the empire fell, something else rose in its place. Christianity, monasteries, quiet centres of survival and memory. Many of them built in remote, cold places where winters taught humility and snow became routine. The empire didn't vanish. It melted, reshaped by the cold into something new. You tuck your feet under your warm blanket and try to imagine a world where the fall of a civilization didn't come from invasion or fire, but from years of disappointing springs, from hungry bellies and long winters, from a sun that stopped shining quite so brightly. Because sometimes it's not the sword that brings down a giant. Sometimes it's a cold breeze. Your breath is fogging up the inside of your helmet. You've already stopped trying to keep your hands warm. There's no point. The gloves help, but not enough. You flex your fingers, slowly, just to remind yourself they're still there. Around you is a world of ice, slick, white, and blinding in the morning sun. You're on a ridge overlooking the Chosin Reservoir in North Korea, December 1950. And it's not just the enemy you're fighting, it's the cold itself. This is the Korean War, and you're smack in the middle of one of its most brutal chapters. The Battle of Chosin, where temperatures dropped so low that weapons jammed, blood froze, and frostbite became more feared than bullets. The Korean War isn't always the first one that gets remembered, but for those who fought in it, especially here, in the mountains of northeastern Korea during the winter of 1950, there's no forgetting it. Because this wasn't just a battle, it was a climatic nightmare, and it changed the way militaries thought about weather, possibly forever. Historical fact: during the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, temperatures dropped to minus 35 degrees Celsius, minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills that made it feel even colder. This wasn't some short, cold snap. It was a sustained, punishing deep freeze that lasted through the entire 17-day battle. US Marines and other United Nations forces were encircled by 120,000 Chinese troops. Outnumbered, undersupplied and surrounded, the 1st Marine Division fought its way out, in the snow, over mountains, under constant attack. Their motto: retreat hell, we're just attacking in another direction. But the enemy wasn't just China, it was winter. You can barely fire your weapon. The oil in the rifles has congealed. Soldiers are urinating on gun parts to warm them enough to function. Grenades won't detonate because the fuses are frozen. Sea rations become inedible bricks of beef stew. Radio batteries die within minutes. Bandages freeze to wounds. And every night, you sleep next to men who might not wake up come morning. You're wearing every layer of gear you've got. It doesn't help. Your feet are numb. Your ears are ringed with ice. You're not thinking about tactics or glory anymore. You're thinking about whether you'll still have toes by the end of this patrol. You wonder how long a man can last in this cold before his body just gives up. And here's your quirky fringe fact. The Marine Corps issued Mickey Mouse boots, massive rubberized footwear designed to trap warm air, but they arrived too late for many at Chosin. Before that, soldiers were stuffing newspaper, extra socks, even toilet paper into their boots to stave off frostbite. It worked, sort of, but not well enough. Thousands were evacuated not because of wounds, but because their limbs were turning black. Military historians often point to Chosin as a miracle of endurance, a tactical withdrawal under apocalyptic conditions. The terrain was unforgiving, the roads were icy death traps, evacuation was nearly impossible. Helicopters, when they could fly, carried the injured out one by one. But the fighting didn't stop. The retreat was a battle in itself, over mountains, through ambushes, in the kind of cold that makes your soul ache, and the numbers? Devastating. Of the 30,000 UN troops involved, around 17,000 became casualties, many due to frostbite. Chinese forces suffered even more, up to 50,000, including tens of thousands who froze to death in thin cotton uniforms. The Chinese soldiers had no winter gear, no medical support. They attacked anyway, wave after wave. Some never made it within rifle range. They froze before they could fight. There's still debate among scholars and military analysts about whether the UN forces could have anticipated such extreme conditions. Should they have had better winter gear? Better supplies? Maybe. But even now, the weather at Chosin is seen as a once-in-a-century anomaly, a perfect storm of terrain, temperature, and tactical chaos. Some believe the cold saved lives, slowing Chinese advances, freezing roads, and giving the UN just enough breathing room to escape. Others argue it almost destroyed the division completely. You pull back from the memory, wrapped in your own blanket, heater purring softly in the corner, and you try to imagine what it was like, standing in a foxhole full of snow, boots soaked, fingers blackening, watching flares pop in the sky as enemy troops move in again. You chew on a frozen chocolate bar because it's the only thing you can stomach. You wrap a scarf around your face so the skin won't split open from the wind. You cry, but the tears freeze on your cheeks, and through all of it you keep going, because the cold doesn't care if you're a Marine or a civilian. It doesn't care who wins or loses. It just takes. Heat, movement, memory. The men who survived Chosin were called the Frozen Chosen, a nickname that sounds almost light-hearted until you understand what it cost. Today, Chosin is studied in military academies around the world, not just for its tactics, but for what it taught. Weather is a weapon. The Earth itself can be an ally or an enemy. It can turn soldiers into statues. It can freeze a war in place. You lie still now, warm and safe, and try not to take it for granted. Because for those 17 days in the winter of 1950, warmth was a distant dream, and the world was nothing but snow, blood, and breath. You're standing in a trench, knee-deep in mud and ice water, staring out across a barren, frozen field of shattered trees and silent craters. It's Europe, it's 1916, and you're on the Western Front of World War I. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas 2 years ago has turned into a grinding, frozen stalemate. And now, with winter pressing down like a leaden sky, you're learning what thousands already know. Cold doesn't stop war, it just makes it more miserable. You're wrapped in a heavy wool coat that hasn't been dry since you were issued it. Your gloves are stiff with frost. Your boots might as well be buckets. Every toe you have feels like it belongs to someone else. The smell down here is part rot, part gunpowder, and part something worse. Wet fabric that's forgotten what dry feels like. Someone coughs. Someone else mutters a prayer. The morning frost crunches underfoot, then gives way to slush. You're not sure which is worse. Here's your historical fact. Winter conditions on the Western Front were so brutal that entire battalions suffered mass casualties from exposure alone. In the winter of 1916 to 1917, temperatures in France dropped well below freezing, with heavy snowfalls that clogged trenches, froze equipment, and immobilized men. Frostbite and trench foot became epidemic. Medical stations were overwhelmed, not just with wounds, but with blackened limbs, swollen joints, and soldiers who simply couldn't stop shivering. And then there's the snow. It softens the battlefield, dulls the edges. Bullets still fly, but they land with quieter thuds. The artillery is no less deadly, but the sound is stranger, muffled by powder-dusted fields. You think that might be a kindness, until you realise the snow also conceals bodies, and in a trench war where land is gained and lost by the yard, that means stepping over someone who might not be sleeping. You watch as a young private pours hot water into a metal mug and stirs in a chunk of whatever is passing for coffee today. The steam rises and vanishes instantly. He hands it to you. You sip. It's mostly warm, mostly bitter, and entirely priceless. Little comforts mean everything when the world outside is a hell frozen over. Here's your quirky fringe fact. To combat trench foot, officers eventually ordered troops to grease their feet with whale oil before putting on dry socks. Each soldier required multiple tins of the stuff, applied daily. It helped, marginally. But you still ended up with medical diaries full of grotesque drawings, feet ballooned to twice their size, toes like purple marshmallows, nails peeling off like wet bark. You hear about the Christmas truce of 1914, when soldiers from both sides emerged from their trenches, shook hands, exchanged cigarettes, even played soccer in the snow. It sounds almost quaint now, because that was before the war became machinery, before the gas, the tanks, the endless waves of mud and steel. By the time 1916 arrives, that magic is gone. No one's singing carols anymore. The snow isn't festive. It's just more weight on a war that already feels like it might last forever. And now for the academic squabble. Some scholars argue that winter slowed the pace of war, offering natural ceasefires due to impassable conditions. Others claim it made things worse, trapping soldiers, making supply lines even more fragile and turning minor infections into amputations. There's no consensus, but everyone agrees on this. The cold didn't help. It didn't kill as fast as the guns, but it worked steadily, silently in the background. You remember reading somewhere that generals planned entire offensives around the weather. They'd wait for a thaw, a freeze, a fog. Sometimes that played in their favour. Other times, it led to disasters like the Battle of Passchendaele, where soldiers drowned in mud-filled craters during torrential autumn rains that quickly gave way to frost, trapping the dead in icy shells. You look down at your own boots now. They're caked in layers of slush and grime, and somewhere beneath that is a sock you haven't changed in days. You can't feel your toes, you don't want to, because if you do, you'll realise they've already gone numb, and numbness in a trench is never a good sign. The shelling starts again, distant thuds at first, then closer. You duck instinctively, even though you've been through this before. Snow sprays up from the lip of the trench. Somewhere, someone yells. Somewhere else, someone doesn't. You press your back against the icy wall of the trench and breathe slowly through your nose. 1 breath. 2. The snow falls again, undisturbed by the violence. It always comes back, like it has no memory of what it covered yesterday. And then the quiet returns. Not peace, just silence. You pull your coat tighter, sip the last of your coffee, listen to the wind whistling through broken barbed wire. Back in your bed now, the blankets soft and forgiving, you think about those men, boys really, frozen in mud, writing letters home with shaking hands, telling their mothers they're fine, that the cold isn't so bad, that Christmas will be nice this year. They didn't talk about trench rot or frozen rice or trying to sleep with rats nestled in their armpits for warmth. That's the part they left out. Because what happens in a frozen trench in northern France doesn't make for polite conversation. It stays there, buried under snow and silence and time. But history remembers, and so do you. You're walking across a darkened city, your boots clicking on frozen asphalt, your breath puffing out in white bursts that vanish almost as quickly as they appear. Above you the sky is black, clear, and utterly still. It's the kind of cold that feels like it's waiting for something, listening. You pass shuttered shops, dark homes, lampposts flickering dimly. If at all, you're in Texas, of all places, February 2021, and what you're feeling isn't just cold, it's collapse. This was supposed to be a quick winter snap. A novelty, maybe. Something people would laugh about on social media while sipping cocoa and posting selfies in rare snow. But then the power went out, and then the water stopped running, and then people started dying in their homes, wrapped in blankets, surrounded by candles and silence. This wasn't quaint. This was Winter Storm Uri. one of the most devastating and surreal weather disasters in recent US memory. Historical fact: in mid-February 2021, an Arctic air mass descended far further south than usual, plunging the state of Texas and large swaths of the southern US into a deep freeze. Temperatures dropped to -2 degrees Fahrenheit, -19 degrees Celsius, in places like Dallas. Millions lost power as the state's power grid, isolated, deregulated, and deeply unprepared for cold, buckled under demand. Rolling blackouts became full outages, frozen pipes burst, water treatment facilities failed, grocery stores emptied in hours, roads iced over, people were trapped, in the dark, in the cold, with no idea when it would end. And here you are, walking through it, looking up at the stars, wondering how a place known for barbecue, sunburns, and air conditioning suddenly became the setting for a slow-motion disaster movie. You pass a family huddled in a parked car, engine idling. You smell gasoline and hear the faint hum of heat. They're not going anywhere, they're living in that car tonight. You see another house with flickering lights and a cord snaking out to the driveway, where it plugs into a neighbour's generator. Sharing power, sharing survival. No one's asking political questions right now. They're asking, do you have heat? Or, can I borrow some water? Now for the quirky fringe detail. In some neighbourhoods, locals began melting snow in buckets just to flush toilets. Others used pool water, or even boiled water from hot tubs. There were even reports of campfires being built inside living rooms, chimneys or not. A fire marshal in Houston described the scene as a return to pre-industrial life, overnight. The smell of wood smoke mixed with the sound of emergency sirens and cracking pipes. And it wasn't just the cold, it was the infrastructure failure. Texas operates its own power grid, ERCOT, largely disconnected from the two national grids that cover the rest of the country. That independence, while useful for avoiding federal regulation, came with a cost. No backup. No easy way to borrow energy from other states when demand spiked. And because Texas doesn't usually get Arctic temperatures, most power plants weren't weatherized. Turbines froze, natural gas lines clogged with ice, equipment failed, not because of snow, but because it was never meant to operate in these conditions, and the debate exploded. Some blamed wind power, others pointed to the gas infrastructure, some shouted about green energy failure, others pointed out that this wasn't a political failure, it was a planning failure, one that left 4.5 million people without power in freezing conditions, one that killed at least 246 people, though some experts believe the real number is far higher. Not all deaths in freezing homes make the news, and the most unsettling part? It wasn't that cold, not compared to, say, Minnesota or Canada. The problem wasn't the temperature, it was the unpreparedness. A modern state brought to its knees, not by a blizzard but by a weather system that wandered a little too far south. You pass a woman carrying firewood in a plastic laundry basket, her breath sharp, her face red. She nods at you, the kind of nod that says, yeah, this is real. A dog trots beside her, paws lifting high in the snow. Somewhere in the distance a siren wails, then cuts out. You pass a grocery store with a handwritten sign taped to the window. No water, no bread, no milk. Try again. Tomorrow. Some scholars now call this a climate wake-up call. Not because it was caused by climate change directly, but because it showed how fragile even rich, developed societies are when weather steps out of bounds. As warming continues, weird winters like Uri could become more common. Polar vortexes dipping lower, jet streams meandering like lost rivers. It won't always be hotter. Sometimes it'll be colder in places that aren't ready. There's already debate about how to fortify the grid. Weatherproofing, regulation, redundancy. But the conversation comes too late for the people who froze in mobile homes, in apartments without insulation, in houses where pipes exploded like water balloons. Back in your own space, warm, well lit, humming with stable electricity. You try to shake the feeling, but it sticks. The idea that just a few degrees of cold, in the wrong place at the wrong time, can turn a state upside down. That weather doesn't need to be record-breaking to be catastrophic, it just needs to outpace the plan. And maybe that's the lesson tonight. That winter doesn't always look like war or famine or collapse on the scale of empires. Sometimes, it looks like a ceiling fan frozen in place, a sleeping bag unzipped on a living room floor, a mother boiling snow to bathe her kids. Sometimes it looks like a flashlight beam cutting through a dark hallway, looking for a switch that no longer works, And now here you are, warm, safe, eyes heavy, wrapped in blankets that, mercifully, haven't frozen to your skin. The room is still. The lights are soft. There's probably a gentle hum in the background. Your fan, maybe, or the fridge doing its quiet mechanical breathing. You made it through. Not just this bedtime story, but through 1,000 years of winter, one icy footstep at a time. You've travelled across myth and empire, famine and firewood, siege and snowfall. You've marched with Napoleon until your breath turned to frost. You've huddled inside a Leningrad apartment waiting for soup that wouldn't come. You've watched the Mississippi freeze, the Baltic become a highway, and southern Italy stare blankly at snow that shouldn't exist. You've learned that history isn't just made in summer, when kings parade and crops wave in the breeze. It's also made in the dead of winter when everything slows, shivers, and sometimes stops altogether. There's something deeply humbling about that, isn't there? The idea that ice, not ideology, not invention, not ambition, can undo everything. That all it takes is a sky gone quiet, a sun that hides for too long, and suddenly the strongest systems begin to creak. No matter how advanced we think we are, we still wear coats, light fires, check weather apps before we leave the house. We're still just people in the cold, hoping the thaw comes soon. But there's also resilience, because time and again through all these stories someone figures it out. They dig the roof out, or build a better boot, or write a symphony in the middle of a siege. People adapt, they survive. Not always beautifully, not always fairly, but enough to keep going. And maybe that's what matters. So now finally you can let it go. Let your mind wander somewhere quieter, somewhere warmer. The ice is behind you, the fire is crackling, the danger has passed. Let the snow keep falling if it wants.